Chapter 887. Several undead soldiers cautiously approached the corpse of the undead dragon. Among them, Jed used the long sword in his hand to touch it, but the undead dragon did not react. Its body had long since become an empty shell. "It's fine now," Jed smiled and gestured to the back. "Jed, you dig out that guy's crystal core now." Elanti's dark gray beard trembled slightly as he said with a smile, "All right, Uncle Elanti." The undead soldier named Jed nodded. He raised his sword high and ruthlessly stabbed it into the skull of the undead dragon. Kacha! The sharp long sword easily split open the skull of the undead dragon. Not long after, a snow-white crystal the size of an egg was extracted. This is the crystal core of a divine tier beast. It's so beautiful. Jed held the crystal core in his hand and quietly felt the vigorous and surging energy. His body trembled and his expression became excited. Divine tier beasts were extremely rare to begin with, and hunting them was even more difficult. Such a large and complete crystal core of a divine tier beast. How many black crystal coins could he sell for? What is this? At this time, Jed suddenly noticed some strange light flashing within the crystal core. Then, with a boom, the brown-haired undead soldier felt as if his head had been ruthlessly struck by something. Then his mind went blank. "Jed, Jed," several guards softly called out to him, only to see Jed standing there in a daze, motionless. He held the crystal core in his hand as if he had lost his mind. He did not even hear the people beside him calling out to him. "Jed, Jed, what are you doing? Immediately bring that divine tier beast crystal core over. It belongs to the Lich King." The captain of Ron's bodyguards, Elander, immediately realized that something was wrong. His first reaction was that Jed wanted to take the divine crystal core for himself. The most valuable part of the divine crystal core was the divine crystal core. However, when he thought of that, he couldn't help but laugh. Even if Jed was his nephew and a warrior who had been trained by him, even if he really wanted to take the divine crystal core, he would have to calculate how many heads he had. Now, that tens of thousands of people were watching, how could he do that? "Mother of Asterisker, did you hear me when I called you?" Seeing that his nephew was still motionless as if he hadn't heard his words, Elanda finally lost his temper. He grabbed Jed's shoulder and pulled him over. "What?" As soon as he made eye contact with Jed, Elantra felt a buzzing sound in his head and was startled. He saw a face that did not belong to the undead at all. At this moment, Jed's eyes had turned gray, and his handsome face had become extremely twisted and ferocious. His whole body was emitting an evil, demonic, and ferocious aura, as if he was a ferocious beast from ancient times. The captain of the guards, Elander, took a big step back in shock and stuttered, Jed, what happened to you?" Unfortunately, Jed didn't reply to his beloved Uncle Elantra. Instead, the only response he got was a beast-like roar. "Be careful. Back off quickly," when the guards finally realized that something was wrong and shouted loudly. It was too late to say anything. Jed raised his hand, and with a swoosh, a silver light flashed, and a bright red line of blood appeared on Elander's neck. Elander stood there in a daze, his face full of disbelief. He never thought that he would be killed by his nephew. Jed actually killed his own uncle? The surrounding guards were dumbfounded. All of this happened too quickly. It was like a dream that made them feel unreal. However, they were still well-trained elites. Very quickly, they pulled out their swords. In an instant, Jed was surrounded by dozens of swords. "Huff! Huff!" Jed panted wildly and kept growling in a low voice. The blue veins on his face protruded and wriggled like snakes, looking very frightening. "Jed, what did you do?" "Damn it, you're crazy, put down the sword." A guard who was very familiar with Jed said loudly. "No, he's not Jed anymore." Another guard shouted, "His soul has been—" Before the guard could finish his words, Jed had already rushed over with his sword like a madman and slashed with it. "Quick! Stop him now. He's too strong. Let's go together. Kill him." At this time, the undead soldiers finally recovered from their shock and rushed forward with a roar, fighting with Jed. Bang! Bang! Boom! The power surged, making a loud noise and raising a lot of smoke and dust. It was chaos in front of them. Yeah, what's going on over there? The movement in front finally attracted Ron's attention. At this time, an undead soldier quickly ran up. Reporting to the Lich King, Jed suddenly went crazy for some reason and killed his uncle, the captain of the guards, Lord Elander. What? When Ron heard this, he was shocked. He turned his head and saw that a black shadow had appeared above his chair at some point. A ferocious undead warrior was staring at him, and the exposed veins on his face were terrifying. It's him, the undead dragon. It's not dead yet. Feeling that familiar power, Ron's heart suddenly tightened. At this time, Jed let out a long howl. From his body, countless things like ghosts burst out and flew in the sky. What's this? Ron's eyebrows twitched. He saw with his own eyes that the things like ghosts disappeared after drilling into the undead soldiers' bodies. Ron suddenly had an ominous premonition. Not long after, something even more shocking happened. The undead soldiers who had ghosts drilling into their bodies suddenly went crazy. They raised the swords in their hands and stabbed their comrades who had been through life and death with them. Damn it, what are you doing? Are you crazy? An undead soldier who was stabbed by a sword cried out in pain. He raised his sword and blocked the other party's attack. No, no. The soldier who was holding the sword had a face full of horror. My body is out of my control. What? The undead soldier was shocked. What the hell are those things? They're biting my soul. Ah, it hurts. The undead soldier's face was full of pain. He cried out in pain, but his sword still stabbed his comrade mercilessly. This is soul erosion? The chaotic scene in front of him made Ron's hands and feet turn cold. Soul erosion was one of the most sinister and despicable types of necromancy magic. It first took control of a living being's body, then slowly eroded and devoured their souls, turning their bodies into its own. The most terrifying thing was that the creatures whose souls had been eroded couldn't do anything. They could only watch as everything happened, from losing control of their bodies to losing their souls, and finally becoming slaves of the undead dragon. Generally speaking, soul erosion could only erode the soul of one creature at a time, and this undead magic was also extremely harmful to one's own soul. However, the undead dragon was extremely powerful. It could transform into thousands of ghosts and control multiple targets. Chaos, complete chaos. The undead soldiers whose bodies had been occupied by the undead dragon were fighting with the undead soldiers whose bodies had not been occupied. No one could tell the other apart. They only felt that there were swords stabbing at them from all directions. Some undead creatures stood up. They had been summoned by the necromancers, but no one knew which necromancer had summoned them. Everyone, regardless of whether they were controlled or not, fell into a frenzy of killing. Screams and sounds of killing intertwined together. Countless undead soldiers fell into pools of blood. Even in death, they did not know where the sword that killed them came from. What should I do? Ron was at a loss. These guys whose bodies had been occupied by the undead dragon were his most loyal subordinates. When he swung his sword at him, could he really attack without any scruples? The undead dragon was indeed the most troublesome divine beast to deal with. At this moment, Ron finally understood. Its skeletal body was only its shell, and its powerful soul was its true body. However, what was even more frightening was that the undead dragon's true body had countless incarnations. It was impossible to destroy them all. Careless, too careless. Ron fell into deep self-reproach. If he had completely destroyed the undead dragon's soul back then, Lord Lich King, be careful. Just as Ron was in a daze, a warning came from behind him. Before Ron could turn around, he saw a black shadow pouncing at him. It's Wesker. Ron recognized the undead pouncing at him with a single glance. He was one of his guards, an optimistic and confident young undead. He laughed all day long, and those who were with him would be infected by his happiness. However, at this moment, he was thrusting his sword at Ron. Bone cage. Ron's heart trembled. If he wanted to kill Weskier, it would be as easy as flipping his hand, but Ron didn't. His bone cage had firmly trapped Weskier. Weskier, who was being controlled by the bone cage, was like a caged wild beast. He constantly roared, his sinister and twisted face filled with the madness of a wild beast. Lord Lich King, be careful. An undead soldier raised his sword and came to Ron's side, cautiously staring at Weskier in the cage and guarding Ron. Lord Lich King, he's no longer Wesker. Ron took a deep breath and nodded with a serious expression. That's right. He was no longer his guard Weskier. Even if Ron used some method to destroy the undead dragon's soul, Weskier would become an idiot because his soul was completely under the undead dragon's control. Kill me. Kill me. In a daze, Ron suddenly heard Weskier's voice. Although he was firmly trapped by the bone cage, Ron could actually see a trace of pleading in his eyes, which had become crazed and bloodthirsty. Weskier didn't say anything, but from the depths of his soul, he conveyed this message to Ron. Chapter 888. Gad, Gad, Gad. In the ice-crowned castle, located in the southern part of the undead plain, a team of death knights rode past the tall and majestic palace on the long and wide main street. They were fully armed, and their gazes were calm and deep. Even their horses were covered in thick armor. Even from afar, one could feel the strong, killing intent emanating from them. Following closely behind were undead warriors, necromancers, witch doctors, and so on. The heavy meat grinder wheels rolled through the central main street, and the meatball-like abominations followed closely behind. The stone statue of the 10 Victories constantly emitted a demonic light, and a huge shadow flashed in the sky from time to time. That was the majestic body of a frost dragon. From the bleak sound of the horn, the entire ice-crowned castle was filled with an atmosphere of impending war. Both sides of the road were filled with undead who were watching the spectacle. They were watching the grand military parade while pointing at the Scourge army that was like a flood of steel. His Majesty the Divine King is going to war again. It hasn't been that long since the last war, right? Is he going to attack the Plague Legion again? An undead asked. It seems like he's not attacking the Plague Legion this time, but the Forgotten City in Hakant. Another undead said, The Forgotten City? Isn't that occupied by the orcs? We're going to war with the orcs? Heavens, our Divine King's osteodystrophy has finally been cured. This is unbelievable. An undead exclaimed. What? The orcs in the Forgotten City have been chased away by some forces. It's said that they're also undead, and they call themselves the Scourge Legion. Their leader also calls himself the Lich King. In the end, this war is still undead fighting undead. Another undead said after thinking for a while, Yeah, it's always fighting. Our Divine King is too powerful. He can't beat the angels, orcs, demons, or abyss. He can't beat any of the forces, and in the end, he can only vent his anger on the undead. I think that if the Forgotten City was still in the hands of the orcs, Fismai wouldn't dare to start a war even if he had 10 times the courage. The other undead's face was full of mockery. He had long been dissatisfied with Fismai's regime. Yes. It's the same with the Plague Legion. Every time he claims to have one, he would always run back with his tail between his legs, wasting countless black crystal coins to no avail. Such a leader is truly incompetent. The undead creature's words were quickly answered. It said that there were a few times when the armies of hell and the abyss joined forces and forced them to retreat. When they received the declaration of war, our dear Emperor God was so scared that his legs went soft, and he hurriedly retreated and even had to write a letter of apology after retreating. He's a disgrace to the undead. Another undead chimed in. That's right. We undead have become the weakest beings in the main plane. Anyone can bully us. Even the demon faction looks down on us. To be honest, I really want to see the Dreadlord of the Plague Legion, Lord Saruman, lead his army back and hang this incompetent lord. At this moment, an undead citizen said indignantly, Shoo! Just as everyone was discussing excitedly, a slightly older undead stopped them. He looked around vigilantly and said in a low voice, Do you guys want to die? Be careful with your words. There are many people around watching. If this reaches His Majesty Fismai's ears, I think even 10 of your heads would be gone." When the crowd heard this, fear appeared in their eyes. They suddenly became silent. Everyone quietly watched the military parade that they had watched countless times. After a while, an undead suddenly shouted, "Look! His Majesty the Divine Emperor is coming out." At this moment, a hunched figure appeared on the tall palace's military platform. He had a head full of white hair and wore a black robe. His skinny figure wore a pure gold crown. This was the Emperor God of Calamity, Phismai, the highest leader of the Plague Legion. He walked over confidently and appeared in the grand military parade. "It's time for us to cheer," one of the undead said with a bitter smile. They were forcefully dragged into this boring military parade, and this was the only role they could play. "Long live His Majesty Emperor God. Long live His Majesty." Phismai stood on the platform with an expressionless face. His eyes were listless as he stared down. Excessive alcohol and women had hollowed out his body. He waved his arms weakly in response to the cheers of tens of thousands of his undead subjects. Although he did not know how many of his subjects' cheers were sincere, he did not care. What Phismai cared about was his power and his identity as the successor of the Plague Legion. When he heard that another successor of the Plague Legion had appeared, it undoubtedly provoked his sensitive nerves. The commander-in-chief of the Plague Legion, Tito, stood beside the Emperor God of Calamity. He was fully armed in his military uniform, and the emblem of a skull was engraved on his shoulder. His figure was not very tall, and his expression was full of majesty. It was a stark contrast to the Emperor God of Calamity who was standing beside him. "Don't you want to reconsider? My dear Commander-in-Chief, is the Staff of Calamity so important to you?" The Emperor God of Calamity waved his hands at the cheering undead subjects below, and said to Tito without turning his head, "As long as you nod, all the glory will still be yours." "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I think I've made it very clear. I won't do anything to the owner of the Staff of Calamity." Tito shook his head and said calmly and firmly, "Then do you know that to me, this is a form of betrayal? I will execute you." Phismai's eyes narrowed. Phismai narrowed his eyes and turned around abruptly. He glared at Tito with murderous intent in his eyes. "Even though you're the person I trust the most, I still have to do this. This is your right. Your Majesty, Emperor God." Tito's expression remained calm, and there was no trace of fear. "But before that, please allow me to go home and bid farewell to my family." Phismai stared at Tito for a while before slowly retracting his gaze. He was a sensitive and suspicious person. Even Tito, who he trusted the most, would not allow him to come within 10 steps of him. Tito could stand shoulder to shoulder with him because he had handed over his godhood. At this moment, he had no power and was just like an ordinary undead. No, it should be said that he was even weaker than an ordinary undead. Even the undead acolytes were stronger than him. Once he handed over his godhood, he would no longer have any power. His lifespan would also be reduced because he had lost his power, and he would become like an ordinary undead. Phismai knew that it was useless to threaten Tito with death. Since he had handed over his godhood, he was no longer a god and was destined to die. What Phismai valued was Tito's prestige in the army. Rumble, rumble. At this moment, a huge rumble sounded from the main street of the Ice-Crown Castle. Fully armed death knights escorted a petite figure as they walked over quickly. Their heavy iron hooves stepped neatly on the ground, causing the entire street to tremble slightly. At this moment, the cheers of the undead subjects reached a climax. "Adele! Adele!" At this moment, Adele was riding the chariot of death slowly. Her steps were not fast, but each step was firm and powerful. The aura on her body was completely different from before. As soon as she appeared, a powerful aura immediately pressed down like a mountain and sea, causing everyone present to feel suffocated. Adele had inherited Tito's godhood, and the current her was already a god. Adele! Adele! Adele did not respond to the cheers of the people. She walked slowly with a grave expression, and powerful death energy spread out. Some small voices entered her ears. "Adele, who's this guy?" "I don't know. The soldiers told us to shout," that. I only know that she's a student of the Scourge Royal Military Academy, and Tito is her mentor. Heavens, has His Majesty gone mad? He actually let a young, undead student become the commander-in-chief, and even replaced Sir Tito? It's said that Sir Tito personally recommended her. Isn't this too outrageous? Hearing these words, Adele could only smile bitterly. Those people were not wrong. Before today, she was only a student of the Scourge Royal Military Academy and a small commander of the 13th Death Knight Regiment. Her mentor Tito had made an exception and promoted her. Not to mention the ordinary subjects. Even in the army, there were many generals who did not know who she was. All of this was arranged by her mentor. Quietly sensing the power of the godhood from the depths of her soul, Adele could not be happy no matter what. She knew that her mentor had let her inherit the godhood, but the price was his life. Adele knew some rumors about the discord between His Majesty God King Fismai and Professor Tito. So before accepting this mission, Adele repeatedly asked God King Fismai to guarantee Professor Tito's safety, at least for his limited life. His Majesty the Divine Emperor had agreed, and Adele appeared in the square of the army ceremony as the commander-in-chief. Fismai's heart was filled with murderous intent, but he did not. This was included in his promise to Adele. This female Death Knight with the godhood was much more difficult to deal with than Tito, who had been loyal to him all his life. Fismai did not know what Tito meant, but he was confident that he could turn an ordinary student of the Scourge Royal Military Academy into a new Tito, stronger and more loyal than Tito. Adele walked to the center of the parade square and jumped off her warhorse. She took off her helmet, and her long hair fluttered in the wind. At this moment, the entire parade square quieted down. Countless eyes stared at the tall figure in the center of the square. Adele took a step forward, her face sacred and solemn. She knelt on one knee towards the Divine Emperor of Scourge on the high platform, and her low voice spread far and wide through the divine power of death. I, Death Knight Adele, swear in the name of the Knight that I am loyal to His Majesty the Divine Emperor of Scourge, His Majesty the Divine Emperor of Scourge, whom I have revered all my life. I will abide by my heart and will have no regrets. If I break this oath, may the long sword in my hand abandon my soul and be banished to depravity forever. I accept your allegiance. Your Highness Adele, may you achieve a glorious victory in this battle. Fismai said slowly. At this moment, Adele raised her head, and her gaze slowly swept across the Divine Emperor Fismai and fixed on Professor Tito beside him. She took a deep breath and raised her voice at the same time. Long live His Majesty the Divine Emperor. Long live His Majesty the Divine Emperor. In an instant, all the undead were infected by Adele's enthusiasm. They spontaneously cheered, and their voices swept through the entire ice-crowned castle like a wave. Do you think Adele's ability is up to the task? Fismai greeted his subjects with a fake smile and a light wave of his arms as he spoke to Tito. I don't doubt her strength or loyalty, but I doubt her ability. If it wasn't for your full recommendation, I definitely wouldn't have considered it. She's too young. Adele is a military genius. There's no doubt about that. Tito looked at Adele with a knowing smile on his face. It's just that she's too inexperienced. I'm worried that she won't be able to convince the masses, but I believe she can solve this problem. Fismai didn't say anything. He looked down with an uncertain expression. Adele mounted the warhorse of death. At this moment, there was no longer any confusion in her eyes. There was no longer any hesitation. She suddenly pulled the reins. Let's go. Chapter 889. Boom! Boom! At this moment in the Crying Valley, the situation was chaotic. Everyone had lost their minds and fell into a frenzy of killing. Even though Ron's strength had reached the level of a god, he could not stop all this. He hardened his heart and killed many of the undead who were once loyal to him. However, more undead rushed towards him with weapons in their hands. Their faces were full of hatred and madness. What should I do? Ron forced himself to calm down and quickly thought of countermeasures. At this time, he saw a familiar figure. Jed? He is Jed. Jed did not go forward to fight. He stood in the crowd and commanded the undead whose souls were occupied to launch wave after wave of attacks. He was the first undead whose body was occupied by the undead dragon. Could it be that the true soul of the undead dragon is in his body? Ron thought hard. Not long after, his eyebrows gradually relaxed. That's it. Ron made up his mind and vowed to kill this guy completely. Boom! An extremely cold breath instantly enveloped Jed and then spread out at a very fast speed. With Jed as the center, all the undead in the surrounding area were affected. Jed's speed slowed down significantly. He glanced at Ron, and his anthropomorphic eyes contained fear. A divine-level beast had basic intelligence. When he saw Ron, he knew that the other party was an enemy he could not afford to provoke. At this moment, the only thing he could think of was to escape. "Where do you think you're going?" Ron shouted and chased with the scourge staff in his hand. Jed's escape confirmed Ron's speculation. It must be the undead dragon without a doubt. Jed was a little panicked. He growled, and the undead whose souls were occupied by him suddenly surrounded him. "Kill!" A murderous intent flashed in Ron's eyes. At this moment, he was no longer merciful. Boom! Boom! Dozens of undead suddenly fell into a pool of blood. With Ron's current strength, even a god master could easily kill him. He stared at his target and chased after Jed. Roar! With nowhere to run, the undead dragon became even more ferocious. It let out a low roar and pounced on Ron. "Die!" Ron coldly snorted, and an enormous amount of divine energy of death gushed out like a flood. Jed roared. At this time, a beam of cyan light suddenly appeared in its eyes, like a sharp arrow, quickly shooting towards Ron's head. What? That beam of light came too fast, and Ron didn't have time to dodge. The strange green light entered Ron's head, and Ron only felt a loud boom in his sea of consciousness. Then, his mind became blank. The sky gradually darkened. In a small stronghold located at the border of Hakant, as usual, the undead soldiers in the stronghold were patrolling nervously and busily. Teams of fully armed soldiers walked past. Their iron boots stepped on the hard bluestone slabs, making a ka-ka sound, which was very ear-piercing in the silent night. "All of you, brace yourselves. Madame Gloria will be coming to inspect our stronghold in the next few days. If there's any problem, I will tear you apart, extract your souls, and make them into a lamp and put in the latrine." The commander of the stronghold, a tall undead warrior with a fierce face, stood at a high place. His small eyes, which are the size of mung beans, stared at the undead soldiers below and said fiercely, "Yes, my lord." The patrolling undead soldiers quivered when they heard this, and then their spirits rose. They knew in their hearts that Lord Livid was originally the leader of the Beifong bandit group in this area. He had always been tyrannical and committed all kinds of crimes. Later, he surrendered to Ron's scourge and guarded this stronghold. This guy was a master who did what he said. If their souls were really made into a lamp and put in a latrine, it would stink to death. Seeing that the soldiers were in high spirits, Livid smiled with satisfaction and slowly retracted his gaze. "Lord Livid, that's it." At this time, the adjutant standing beside Livid, a middle-aged necromancer, smiled bitterly and said, "The Beifong bandit group? That's it." Livid straightforwardly spread out his hands. "Fail, we are old friends. I know what you're thinking, but I'm sorry to tell you. The Beifong bandit group is no more. I am now the commander of the Scourge's 74th Division." Livid said with a serious face, "Don't mention the Beifong bandit group anymore. I know. Fail smiled embarrassedly. "I just don't like Cronia. This fellow, isn't she the leader of the Shadow Bandit group? In terms of overall strength, perhaps she can't even compare to us. Why? Why do we still have to listen to her in the end? She was one of the earliest people who pledged loyalty to Ron, Lich King. This is something that can't be helped." Livid muttered to himself and smiled. "But I believe that with my strength, replacing Cronia is a definite matter. As for the Lich King, He will see my ability and loyalty sooner or later. But Phil did not give up and continued. With our Bayphone Bandit group strength, we have many more choices. Why don't we choose the other side? For example, the one in the Ice Crown Castle. Isn't he also a member of the Scourge? You mean Fismare? That fellow who calls himself the Scourge God Emperor? Livid laughed coldly. That's not as good as Lord Ron. At least he is the legal successor and has the Scourge God staff. Fail went silent for a while before raising his head and smiling. Since the leader has already made up his mind, I have nothing else to say. I'll leave first to take care of some matters. Go. Livid smiled and patted Fail's shoulder. You have been with me for a long time and have always been my most loyal subordinate. If there are benefits, I won't forget you. Thank you, my lord. Fail smiled politely and bowed before turning to leave. Livid watched as Fail left. His smile stiffened and a murderous look appeared in his eyes. Suddenly, he was startled and gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. His tall body shrunk like a leopard. He looked around and said unhappily, "Come out. He's already gone so far. What's the point of hiding? Livid, you haven't changed at all. You're always so vigilant. It's really difficult to take advantage of you." A black fog appeared out of thin air. Accompanied by a chuckle, Cronia's figure slowly appeared in front of Livid. Forget it. Livid rolled his eyes at her. In terms of direct combat, you're not as good as me. In terms of concealment and assassination, I'm not as good as you. I'm afraid you've been here for a long time. Why are you still pretending? Cronia smiled and did not admit or deny it. She changed the topic and said, What do you mean? Is there a problem with your subordinates? My intuition tells me there is, but I don't have any evidence. Leviathan nodded and frankly admitted this point. Although he had a rough appearance, his heart was as fine as hair. The Bayphone Bandit group had escaped the encirclement of the Beastmen Frostwolf Corps many times, so Leviathan naturally had some ability. Fail's actions simply couldn't escape his eyes. I'll send someone to keep an eye on him. Livid glanced at Cronia and said, If there's no other way, we'll have to do it even if there's no evidence. Cronia nodded. This matter must be done quickly. I've heard the latest news. The Icecrown Castle has already begun to move. They've sent out an undead army of over 6 million and have already set off in a grandiose manner. War is something that will happen sooner or later. I just didn't expect it to be so soon. Livid took a deep breath. No matter who sat in Physmai's position, they would not tolerate such an existence. The commander over there is Lord Tito, right? You guessed wrong. It really isn't him this time. Cronia smiled. It's a student, an undead called Adele. Adele? I don't know her. Livid furrowed his brows and shook his head. But to be able to become Lord Tito's student, she should have some ability. The appearance of the Calamity Divine staff has given the undead more choices. Lord Ron or Fismai, who will be the true successor? Livid said, We've already deployed everything on our side. Livid probed. An undead army of over 6 million gave him a lot of pressure. We've deployed everything, but the main battlefield isn't here. Cronia sniffled her cute little nose. In terms of numbers, we might be a bit smaller than them, but we have the home advantage. All the troops are complete. The last 2 Frost Dragon caves have also been successfully constructed. We're only waiting to produce Frost Dragons, but Cronia sighed and continued. Lord Lich King has led an army to hunt a god-ranked beast. It's been so many days, and he still hasn't returned. Lord Lolth, who is also dealing with another god-ranked beast, has already returned. I'm a bit worried. What's there to worry about? Livid smiled. If the Lich King can't even deal with a god-ranked beast, then he definitely isn't the Lich King. Since he isn't the Lich King, then there's no need for the Calamity Army to exist. Livid's eyes narrowed, a trace of craftiness flashing through them. Although I've only met him once, I have confidence in him. Although Lord Ron isn't an undead, he has some of the characteristics of an undead. He's humble, brave, confident, as well as unyielding patience and tenacity. I believe that he'll definitely succeed. I hope so. Cronia's heart relaxed, and she smiled. I have to go, Livid. You have to deal with the matter of the spy as soon as possible. Before the war, you have to be decisive. I know. Chapter 890. How was it? Just as Fail returned to his room, a thin, undead, middle-aged man appeared out of nowhere and stared at him as he asked, "You scared me." Fail was startled. He already had a guilty conscience. He walked to the window and looked outside before closing the window. "No, I have no clue at all," Fail said helplessly. "That guy Leviathan will never listen to me. I haven't even started to speak, and he already shut me up with words. So it's like this." The undead middle-aged man impatiently paced back and forth in the dark room. After a long while, he finally made up his mind and said, "Looks like Leviathan has already steeled his heart to follow that fake god. We don't need to waste any more time on him. Lady Adele's undead army is about to arrive. Fail. If you do this." The two of them lowered their voices as they spoke. At this moment, a burst of chaotic footsteps could be heard from afar, rushing towards the room. When the undead middle-aged man heard this, his expression immediately changed as he pushed Fail. "Damn it, you betrayed me?" "I didn't." Fail was anxious when he heard this. He did not know where he had exposed himself, but he did not expect that Cronia had already set her eyes on him. At this moment, Leviathan's rough and loud voice could be heard from outside the door. "Fail, stop resisting. Who is that guy inside?" He doesn't seem to belong to our stronghold. Hand him over and you'll be fine." "What do we do?" Fail was so frightened that his face turned pale. He held onto the handle of his magic staff as his body trembled. He knew how terrifying Leviathan was. The undead, middle-aged man's expression was uncertain. "This place has been surrounded. There's no other way. We can only charge out. Kill." Fail threw caution to the wind as his eyes revealed his killing intent. Boom! The two figures broke through the roof and were shocked. They saw that the ground below was densely packed with fully armed undead. Leviathan was standing in the middle of the crowd as he commanded the soldiers to attack. The undead middle-aged man's heart sank to the bottom. They had already discovered it. "Kill!" Livid waved his long sword, and countless undead spells rained down like raindrops. After killing Fail, the spy, Leviathan's expression was gloomy and terrifying. After a long while, he weakly waved his hand. "Men!" A lean undead youth quickly walked to Livid's side. "Where is Fismer's army now?" Reporting to Lord Livid, "They have already crossed our border and are advancing towards the stronghold. They are only 300 kilometers away from us." "What? You actually came so quickly?" A look of shock flashed across Leviathan's eyes. 300 kilometers seemed very far, but with the speed of the Frost WIRM, it would only take a little more than half a day. This meant that his small stronghold would soon encounter Fismai's Calamity army. Leviathan pondered for a moment and said, "Pass down my order. All soldiers in the stronghold are to carry out Plan B immediately." "Yes, Lord Livid," the undead youth replied loudly. For hours later, when the sky was just beginning to turn bright, the peaceful stronghold suddenly began to shake. Then, the bleak sound of a horn resounded throughout the land. What is that?" "It's Fismai's scourge. They're finally here, heavens. Frost dragons. Even their frost dragons have been mobilized." A dragon's roar suddenly came from the sky. Immediately after, a frost aura rushed over, causing all the undead in the stronghold to tremble. Calm down, calm down." Leviathan quickly walked out of the room and shouted loudly. As the person in charge of the stronghold, he patrolled the area once every hour without slacking off. He only rested when the sun was about to rise. Who would have thought that the enemy would arrive before he could even take off his armor? "Activate the defenses immediately. Ghost Tower, get ready. Necromancers, get ready." Under Leviathan's command, the entire stronghold became busy. The soldiers all ran to their defensive positions, and the poisoned dragon-slaying arrow at the highest point of the stronghold started to move quickly. At this moment, 3 black dots appeared in the sky. Accompanied by a loud roar, 3 huge frost WRMS appeared in the sky above the stronghold, followed by thousands of elite gargoyles. Leviathan knew that they were merely the vanguard of the Scourge army. At this moment, one of the Frost WYRMS roared and spat out a large amount of ice dust. Wherever the ice dust went, all the undead shuddered, and a layer of ice condensed on the stronghold's walls as if by magic. Attack. At this moment, Leviathan was determined to counterattack. Following his command, countless necromancy spells rose from the stronghold. The skulls burning with cyan flames bombarded the Frost WYRMS and elite gargoyles in the sky. Boom! 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 Countless necromancy spells bombarded the Frost WYRMS, creating brilliant sparks in the sky. The Frost WYRMS had huge bodies and strong defenses, but they were too slow. They were simply live targets in the sky. Although the elite gargoyles were faster than the Frost WYRMS, their defenses were too weak. They were shot down in a single exchange. Even if they were lucky enough to survive, they would turn into stone and could no longer participate in the battle. Necromancers wearing black robes and bone armor stood in the middle of the dome of the ghost tower. They held bone staffs in their hands, and there was a huge magic array engraved with mysterious patterns around them. Through this strange magic array, they released their spells. Through this magic formation, the power of the necromancy spells they released was more than twice as powerful as usual. Under such a concentrated attack, one of the Frost WYRMS was the first to be unable to hold on. It let out a roar of despair as its huge body fell. Boom! The huge Frost WYRMS crashed into a small mountain next to the stronghold, and then heavily fell to the ground with a loud sound. A layer of white mist drifted out, and the hair and eyebrows of the nearby undead soldiers were covered in a layer of white frost. Long live! Seeing the Frost WYRMS fall, the undead soldiers in the stronghold let out excited shouts. Their morale was greatly boosted, and they immediately aimed at the remaining 2 Frost WYRMS. Well done! Just like that. Aim! Fire! Leviathan shouted loudly, his face turning a bit red due to his excitement. Winning the first battle was a great honor for him and the undead soldiers in the stronghold. Boom! 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 The battle continued. Flames and ice intersected in the sky, and it was extremely intense. To Leviathan, it was extremely disadvantageous for his side to not have a strong air force in the stronghold. However, it was impossible for him to break through this heavily defended stronghold with just the air force. Soon, the second Frost WYRMS fell. This time, it was the poisoned dragon slaying arrows in the central tower of the stronghold that made the biggest contribution. These defensive tools were extremely slow to activate and reload, and a single shot was enough to heavily injure the Frost WYRMS. The undead soldiers controlling the poisoned dragon-slaying arrows were very clear that these expensive and rare poisoned dragon-slaying arrows couldn't be wasted on those weak gargoyles. Their target was the Frost WYRMS. Well done, little guys, Leviathan excitedly shouted at the undead soldiers in the central tower of the stronghold. After this battle, I will personally ask Sir Lich King to reward you. Kill. The undead soldier's aura was like a rainbow. He quickly turned the mechanism and aimed at the last Frost WYRMS. A huge arrow covered in black flames pierced through the air, whistling through the air as it flew. On a small hill to the side, the commander of the Scourge army, Adele, silently watched the battle in the stronghold, not saying a word for a long time. The battle situation was unfavorable for their side, but Adele didn't want to interfere. She didn't want to immediately break through this stronghold that was as sturdy as a stone statue. Her goal was to probe, to find out the opponent's true strength. Indeed, from the results, the strength of this Scourge army that came out of nowhere far exceeded Adele's expectations. The entire stronghold's attacks were neat and orderly. Even though they didn't have a strong air force and only relied on ground defense, they were still able to fight well. This stronghold's commander wasn't an idiot. Chapter 891. My dear Commander-in-Chief, what are you thinking about? Following the sound of a pleasant voice, a graceful figure suddenly appeared behind Adele. She was a standard undead female and was slightly older than Adele. She wore an extremely tight black necromancer robe that accentuated her well-proportioned figure, enough to make most women jealous. The skirt only covered her knees by a few centimeters, revealing a pair of perfectly round, snow-white legs. Even though she was on the battlefield, she still wore exquisite indifference. Her tight body and the half of her upper body that was deliberately exposed showed that she was a seductress who could make men go crazy in bed. The name of the undead female that appeared in front of Adele was Scarlet. She was a proud necromancer and also the military commander of the Calamity Army, in charge of military affairs. She was originally the wife of one of His Majesty Phizm's ministers, but many undead in Icecrown Castle knew that this woman was a famous social butterfly in Icecrown Castle. She had close relations with many important figures in the Calamity Dynasty, and even the highest symbol of the Calamity Dynasty, His Majesty Phizm, were so-called father and daughter. However, Adele knew that her true identity was actually His Majesty Phizm's lover. "You've come." Adele frowned and nodded as a greeting. She didn't have much of a good impression of this woman to begin with. She knew that this woman had been sent by His Majesty Phizm to monitor her. In the end, His Majesty Phizm still didn't feel at ease with her. Scarlet's pair of beautiful eyes rested on Adele's face for a short while before turning away. Ever since she had seen Adele for the first time, she had been filled with hostility towards Adele. Adele's background, status, strength, and so on were all things that she could only hope to reach. More importantly, Adele was younger than her and prettier than her. This was something that Scarlet couldn't tolerate no matter what. Ever since the expedition, Scarlet had been thinking of ways to properly deal with Adele. As the military commander, she had the authority to directly report to the Calamity Emperor Phizm. However, along the way, Adele didn't even speak to her, let alone report to her. She treated her like air, which made Scarlet so angry that she almost went crazy. However, she couldn't do anything to Adele. She only had the authority to supervise, but not to punish. As the successor of the commander-in-chief of the Calamity Army, Sir Tito, only His Majesty Phizm had the authority to punish Adele. Although the frost dragons are powerful, it's impossible to take down a heavily guarded stronghold with just an air force. Madame Adele, as a top student of the Calamity Army's Royal Military Academy and a proud disciple of Sir Tito, you should understand this principle. At this moment, Scarlet's eyes turned and she smiled. At this moment, she turned her head and carefully observed the reaction on Adele's face. Adele only made a soft mmm sound and didn't comment on Scarlet's words. The other party's cold attitude made Scarlet's heart burn with anger. She said in a more serious tone, "Madam Commander-in-Chief, I think we should send ground troops now." Adele frowned, appearing somewhat dissatisfied. Scarlet's words had obviously overstepped her authority, but she still suppressed the anger in her heart. "Wait a little longer." "What? We have to wait a little longer." When Scarlet heard this, she jumped up in anger. She raised her voice. "Madam Commander-in-Chief, we've already lost 2 of the 3 frost dragons we sent out. There's only one left that's struggling bitterly." Admittedly, frost dragons are only undead creatures. But do you know how many black crystal coins a frost dragon costs? You're seriously being irresponsible for the war. Madam Commander-in-Chief, please take back your accusations. This battle is under my command. I don't need to explain to you what I want to do. Adele finally couldn't hold it in any longer and retorted with a sneer. You. When Scarlet heard this, she trembled with anger. She pointed at Adele, but couldn't say anything. "If Madam Commander-in-Chief has nothing else, please return to your tent and stay there." Adele snorted coldly and turned her head away, directly ordering her to leave. She didn't want to look at this woman again and ruin her mood. "You're ignoring military law, defying the authority of His Majesty the Divine Emperor, and not listening to His Majesty the Divine Emperor's orders." Scarlet's anger finally erupted and she roared loudly. "I'm going to report you to His Majesty the Divine Emperor." Scarlet's words finally enraged Adele. She turned her head and fiercely glared at Scarlet. In an instant, a powerful aura erupted like a mountain. The surrounding atmosphere suddenly dropped to the freezing point, causing Scarlet to instinctively shiver. Only then did Scarlet remember that the other party had inherited Sortito's divinity and was a true god. Pinching her to death would probably be as simple as pinching an ant to death. Whatever. Adele's anger finally didn't flare up. She coldly spat out this sentence and then ignored Scarlet, turning her attention to the battlefield in front of her. Just wait and see. Scarlet's arrogance quickly subsided. After leaving behind a ruthless sentence, she hurriedly left, not daring to stay a moment longer. At this time, a Death Knight quietly approached Adele and said in a low voice, "Commander-in-Chief, Sir June, this woman is always giving orders about our military affairs. It's very troublesome, but we can find a few brothers." Saying so, he made a kill gesture. No, Adele didn't even think about it and directly refused. She's His Majesty the Divine Emperor's people. Scarlet's identity represented the Divine Emperor. This was something Adele still knew. That Death Knight frowned and said, "In the past, Sortito had never sent an overseer. Do your own thing and don't care about anything else." Adele's face was as calm as water as she coldly said, "Reporting." At this time, a Death Knight riding a skeleton warhorse quickly ran up the hillside and saluted while on horseback. "Reporting to Commander-in-Chief, Sir June. Our first batch of meat grinders has arrived." "The meat grinders have arrived? Very good." Adele's eyebrows lightly raised, unable to conceal the joy on her face. Roar. Following a miserable cry in the sky, the last frost dragon finally fell, causing the undead soldiers in the stronghold to burst into cheers. The rest of the gargoyles saw that the situation wasn't good and left the corpses and statues on the ground, screaming as they fled. "We've won." The undead in the stronghold raised their weapons and shouted loudly. Even the solemn Leviathan's face revealed a smile that hadn't been seen in a long time. But before he could be happy for long, a series of zap, zap, zap sound were heard. "It's meat grinders. Heavens, so many meat grinders." In front of them, several hundred meat grinders were pushed to the front line. They were separated into 3 rows, the grand scene causing the undead soldiers in the stronghold to be dumbstruck. A Death Knight in black clothes and black armor ran back and forth, loudly shouting something. "Release." Following the commander's order, several hundred meat grinders moved at the same time. In a moment, several hundred corpses flew into the sky with sharp whistling sounds. Boom, boom, boom. These corpses landed on the walls of the stronghold and exploded like bombs. Cracks appeared on the sturdy walls, and the undead that were hit by the explosion were sent flying by the powerful airflow. Some even fell off the walls. Not good. It's meat grinders. Leviathan's heart sank to the bottom. Ever since he saw the meat grinders being pushed out, Leviathan knew that something was wrong. With so many meat grinders moving at the same time, it was clear that they wanted to destroy the stronghold. Could this be their main force? Leviathan sucked in a breath of cold air. Although he didn't have much hope of defending the stronghold, seeing how powerful the other party was made him anxious. Ka! Another series of mechanical sounds rang out, and several hundred corpses were once again thrown into the air and landed on the walls of the stronghold. Boom, boom, boom. The mountains and earth shook, and the stronghold suffered a destructive blow. Leviathan and his undead soldiers were suppressed by the fierce artillery fire to the point that they couldn't breathe. Several ghost towers were bombarded, and green flames burned fiercely. The poisoned dragon slaying arrow at the highest tower in the center of the stronghold was cut in half by a few cannonballs and fell down with huge flames. The meat grinders were the nemesis of the stronghold. Unless there was a powerful air force, there was no way to counterattack. Or if there was a powerful cavalry unit, the slow meat grinders wouldn't be a match for the cavalry. But at this moment, Leviathan, who didn't have an air force or a powerful cavalry unit, could only watch and do nothing. Leviathan was lying on the ground below the walls, and the falling rocks almost crushed his majestic body. It seemed that it was as Cronia had said. This stronghold couldn't be defended at all, and they were only trying to delay the enemy's army to buy more time for their side. It seems that we can only retreat. Leviathan's mind spun rapidly, secretly calculating the route of retreat. Very good, Adele nodded, satisfied with the meat grinder's effects. Prepare to attack. Yes, my lady. Woo-woo. The desolate sound of the bugle horn rang out once more, and then the entire ground began to shake. Charge, kill. Under Adele's command, the Scourge army began to charge. Countless undead surged forward like a tide, charging towards the stronghold. The Death Knights in heavy armor charged at the front, the long swords in their hands pointed forward, bursting forth with an unstoppable momentum. Behind them were countless zombies, ghouls, and skeleton soldiers. The slow-moving abominations and catapults followed closely behind, their momentum shaking the entire battlefield. As expected, it's their main force. Leviathan's expression changed greatly. Judging from the momentum of the enemy's attack and the shaking of the ground, the enemy had at least 800,000 people, and this didn't include the undead creatures summoned by the necromancers. At this moment, the necromancers in the enemy's undead army began to chant in a low voice. Lord Leviathan, look! An undead soldier pointed not far away and shouted loudly. Leviathan looked and saw that under the necromancer's summoning, the corpses that had been tossed onto the walls were standing up shakily. Not good. We have to retreat immediately. Leviathan's expression changed greatly. This was no longer a matter of whether they should retreat or not. If they delayed any longer, they might not even be able to leave. Rumble, Leviathan had just led the remaining undead out of the stronghold when the stronghold fell. A huge fire ignited on top of the walls, and the raging flames reflected the horizon red. We will definitely return. Leviathan rode on a huge skeletal warhorse. The flames reflected on his face, revealing a calm and unswerving determination. He fiercely pulled on the reins. Chapter 892. The Scourge army, led by Adele, took down many strongholds like a hot knife through butter. They crossed the Crimson Bone River and headed straight for Hakant, not far from the Forgotten City. At this moment, the Forgotten City was in chaos. The Lich King, Ron, who had gone out to hunt god-grade beasts, had disappeared. At the same time, Phizmai's undead army was advancing step by step. The entire Scourge army was as anxious as ants on a hot pan. Reporting, the rebel army has crossed the Whitebone River and reached the burial mound. Reporting, the rebel army is moving very quickly. They have already reached the burial grounds. Reporting, the battle reports from the front lines flew in like snowflakes. Even in the distant Forgotten City, one could smell the scent of war. Countless fully armed undead patrolled the streets. High-grade weapons and equipment that were normally unattainable were openly distributed on the streets. Some undead mages in black robes and white armor walked on the streets, giving out rousing speeches. They called for all undead to take up arms and join the army to resist the rebel army. Ever since the start of the war, the Scourge army on both sides had declared the other side as a rebel army and questioned the legitimacy of the other side's successor. In the main plain, the war between the two Scourge armies had caused a storm. Haha, interesting. In a room in a certain city in the main plain of strength, the heavily armored Long held a battle report in his hands. He softly read it, a trace of joy flashing through his eyes. Phizmai, that coward, he finally couldn't help but make a move. If it weren't for us orcs, your undead army would have already killed their way over. The corner of Long's mouth rose slightly. He suddenly used force, crushing the battle report in his hands into a ball and throwing it on the ground. Ron, don't disappoint me. In the Forgotten City's Hall of the Undead, it was completely silent. The atmosphere was terrifyingly heavy. Shea, is the Lich King really all right? Cronia raised her head and looked at Shea. Her beautiful eyes were filled with anxiety. Shea hesitated for a moment before silently nodding. I can't sense his existence, but I know he should be fine. Through their soul connection, Shea knew that Ron was safe. However, she did not know Ron's exact location or his current situation. Spider Queen Lolth sat quietly on the huge wooden sofa, not saying a word. Her expression was a little uneasy. It's been more than 20 days. What kind of divine tier beast is it? Even Ron can't defeat it? Shea clenched her fists tightly and looked out of the window with her dark eyes. At this moment, the sky was filled with wind and clouds, and the sky was changing color. War is coming. Physmai's army of 6 million was like a dark cloud hanging over everyone's heads. On the other hand, Ron's Calamity army only had 4 million soldiers, and this included the old, weak, and sick. In terms of strength, Ron's Calamity army was clearly at a disadvantage. The Forgotten City's development time was too short. Or rather, God Emperor Physmai didn't give Ron any time to develop at all. The worst thing was that in such a grim situation, the Lich King, Ron, was nowhere to be found. Things couldn't get any worse. Cronia stood up in annoyance and paced around the hall. In order to eliminate the 2 divine tier beasts in the territory, 2 hunting teams set out at the same time. Lolth and the others had returned long ago. Why did Ron? Cronia glanced at Lolth, and her heart sank as if she had understood something. Lady Lolth, do you know what the divine tier beast Ron is hunting is? Lolth's face reddened, and she immediately became embarrassed. Yes, I know. The one occupying the Weeping Valley is an undead dragon. What? Undead dragon? When everyone in the hall heard this, their faces instantly turned deathly pale. Everyone knew that the undead dragon was the most troublesome divine tier beast to deal with. It was proficient in soul attacks and was many times stronger than the divine tier beast Rose had to deal with. Lolth was going to deal with a treant. It looked like a tree on the surface, but it was actually a divine tier beast. It liked to disguise itself as a tree and attack the undead or other beasts that passed by. It was extremely powerful. However, this divine tier treant paled in comparison to the undead dragon. As long as the undead had a normal mind, they wouldn't be willing to deal with an undead dragon that had countless offensive methods and strange soul attacks. What? You already knew? Then why didn't you say anything? Why did you just watch as Ron went to his death? Shea was furious. She slammed her fist on the table with a bang, and the hard stone table immediately shattered into pieces. She glared fiercely at the Spider Queen Lolth, her eyes almost spitting fire. I actually didn't have a choice. Lolth sighed, her face full of sadness. With my strength, I can't deal with the undead dragon at all. I can deal with that treant, but actually, I should have told him. I'm sorry. For the sake of her senseless pride, Lolth chose to hide the truth without any sense of loyalty. However, this action put Ron in danger. She had originally estimated that Ron, who had obtained the Lich King's inheritance, would be able to easily deal with the undead dragon and return victorious. However, it seemed that she had underestimated this divine tier beast. At this moment, Lolth's heart was filled with regret. You bastard. I'll fight you to the death. Shea was so angry that she had already lost her mind. At this moment, she seemed to have forgotten that the other party was a powerful deity. She suddenly drew her sword and slashed at Lolth. Strangely, the powerful Spider Queen didn't dodge or evade. She stood there like a fool, not moving at all. Bing! A loud sound rang out. The sword struck, but it was blocked by Cronia. Shea, calm down. Cronia said anxiously. We can basically confirm that Ron's life isn't in danger. It's just that he might have been delayed by some matters. Moreover, even if Ron unfortunately dies in battle, can't we still use the Dark Altar to revive him? Hearing Cronia's words, Shea calmed down a little. She glared fiercely at the Spider Queen Lolth, but didn't say a word and put away her sword. That's right. Cronia let out a sigh of relief, a trace of smile on her face. Now that the war is about to begin, we shouldn't have internal strife. Only by working together can we defeat them. At this moment, Lolth, who was standing behind Cronia, suddenly stood up and walked out without saying a word. Cronia and Shea were stunned and looked at each other. Cronia couldn't help but ask, "Lady Lolth, where are you going?" "The war is coming." Lolth stood still and quietly looked at the distant sky. She turned her head and smiled at the two. "I can't deny that. I have indeed done something foolish and caused Lord Ron to fall into some kind of danger. Then, let me bear this responsibility alone. Let me fight in the Battle of Talis." A calm voice echoed in the Hall of the Dead, revealing traces of determination. Chapter 893. However, Rose was right. Ron was indeed in trouble. It was unknown when the sounds from the Weeping Valley had stopped. On the spacious ground, corpses were strewn all over the place. Blood flowed freely, as if a picture had been frozen. Ron sat quietly in the middle of the corpses with his eyes closed. At this moment, the veins on his forehead were protruding and writhing like snakes. He had a pained expression on his face. The hunting squad had been completely annihilated, but Ron's battle with the undead dragon was still ongoing. This time, the battlefield was his knowledge sea. At this moment, Ron's face was sometimes fierce and sometimes malevolent. His forehead was covered in sweat and his clothes were already soaked. However, he still sat there motionlessly. Ron was currently in the most dangerous period. All of his soul force had entered his knowledge sea. As long as there was the slightest disturbance in the outside world, even if it was a giant wolf of the lowest level, it could take his life. Fortunately, no other beasts appeared in the territory of the undead dragon. In his knowledge sea, the undead dragon's soul opened its mouth and bit down on Ron's arm, as if it wanted to tear him apart. Ron's soul turned into a giant and used one hand to block the undead dragon's teeth, while the other hand sent out a barrage of punches. One man and one dragon fought in the knowledge sea, causing the entire knowledge sea to surge. Whether it was Ron or the undead dragon, both of them could feel the shock. Ron wanted to destroy the undead dragon's soul, while the undead dragon wanted to crush Ron's will and seize control of Ron's body. To both sides, this was a battle that neither could afford to lose. It was even more dangerous than the previous close combat. Die! In his knowledge sea, Ron's soul punched out and heavily smashed into the undead dragon's head. The undead dragon let out a blood-curdling scream and took a step back. Instead, it pounced forward even more ferociously, opening its mouth and biting Ron's arm. Damn it! Ron endured the pain from the depths of his soul and roared. He broke free from the other party's grip. At this moment, his knowledge sea shook. Not good, Ron cried out in his heart. He saw that the sky above his sea of consciousness had suddenly turned dark. Lightning flashed and thunder roared. Countless cracks appeared in the sky, flashing with lightning. It looked extremely terrifying. Although this battle was disadvantageous for the undead dragon, it was even more disadvantageous for Ron because the location of the battle was his knowledge sea. It was like an enemy breaking into his home. No matter whether he could defeat the enemy or not, most of the bottles and jars in his home would be destroyed. The situation was extremely dangerous. Outside the sea of consciousness, Ron's eyes were tightly shut. His face was so pale that there was no trace of blood. He bit his lips tightly, and bean-sized beads of sweat flowed down his cheeks. No matter how powerful one sea of consciousness was, it couldn't accommodate the battle between two powerful gods. If this goes on, even if I defeat this fellow, I'm afraid that the sea of knowledge will be almost completely destroyed. Ron panted heavily as he thought to himself. If the sea of knowledge was destroyed, it meant that the soul would be shattered, and he would become an idiot without any consciousness. I wonder how Rose and the others are doing? Ron thought. An anxious expression appeared on his face. At this time, his gaze gradually became resolute. No matter what, I have to return alive. After saying that, Ron's soul eyes emitted a blazing light. He roared like a wild beast, raised his huge fist, and walked towards the undead dragon in large strides. The Hengros Basin was one of the largest basins in the Hakant district. It stretched as far as the eye could see. This was also the final barrier of the Forgotten City. It was a wise decision for Cronia to choose this place as the main battlefield. A quiet wind blew past, and Xiao Chao lowered her head. A groundhog gently pushed aside the haystack on the ground and took a look outside. It immediately shrank back in fright. In the desolate Hengross basin, an army had appeared out of nowhere. These soldiers were fully armed. They were dressed in black, and their bone-like white armor emitted a demonic luster under the sun. The blood-red flag fluttered in the wind, and the skull on the flag smiled sinisterly, as if it was the grim reaper from hell. The Spider Empress Rose was sitting on a huge chair made of bones. She wore a tight black robe that wrapped around her beautiful curves and set off her flawless face. She had one hand on her head and the other holding an exquisite pocket watch. She was playing with it, as if she was waiting for something. The morning mist had yet to disperse, and the morning sun shone on the faces of the young, undead warriors, revealing their solemn and dignified faces. At this time, a small puddle beside Rose suddenly trembled, and a circular ripple quickly spread out. Rose noticed this. She frowned, and her beautiful eyes emitted a trace of light. She stared at the small puddle with an incomparably serious expression, as if there were endless mysteries there. At this time, the small puddle trembled again, and a trace of ripple quickly spread out. At the same time, Rose felt her heart tremble violently along with the rhythm of the small puddle. Roar! At this time, a loud roar pierced through the sky, breaking the tranquility of the morning. Dozens of black dots appeared on the horizon, and the black dots grew larger and larger. Dozens of enormous frost dragons flapped their wings, bringing with them a strong frost aura as they pounced. It's coming. It's coming. What's that? Frost dragon. A frost dragon flew over Rose's head, causing everyone to panic. It let out a low roar, then raised its huge head, opened its mouth, and spat out a cold dragon breath. Boom! The cold dragon breath spat out by the frost dragon accurately hit the undead army led by Rose, causing a large cloud of white smoke and a loud explosion. Help! It's so cold. I can't move my body, heal. I need to heal. The undead soldiers were blown away. The cold dragon breath's frost effect even froze the surrounding undead soldiers, making them unable to move. The cold dragon breath continued to descend, causing casualties among the undead soldiers who were hit. It's finally here. Rose closed the pocket watch and put it into the space ring. She stood up, and 8 strange spider legs slowly extended from her back. She coldly stared at the roaring frost dragons flying in the sky, smiled contemptuously, and slowly raised her left hand. Ready, release. Following Rose's command, countless crypt spiders mixed in the army simultaneously spat out a large amount of spider silk into the sky, interweaving into a huge anti-air net. A frost dragon fell into the spider web. It felt as if the spider web stuck to its body had some kind of magical power. Not only did it restrict its movements, but it also constantly pulled its huge body downwards. Roar! The frost dragon screamed. It kept struggling, trying to break free from the spiderweb's control. Unfortunately, its struggle was futile. Its huge body continued to fall, exposing itself to the scourge's attack range. Boom! 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 Countless undead spells rose into the sky. Even without Rose's command, these undead soldiers who were holding their breaths would not let go of this opportunity to beat a drowning dog. The frost dragon that was bound by the spider web could not escape at all. It could only endure the attacks of tens of thousands of undead soldiers, leaving wounds on its huge body. Finally, the frost dragon could not hold on any longer. Its huge body continued to fall until it fell into the crowd. Hooray! Cheers erupted from the undead soldiers. They did the same thing, and another dozen or so frost dragons were pulled down, becoming the targets of their undead magic. The crypt spiders and the undead soldiers worked closely together, making it difficult for the frost dragons to gain any advantage. In the blink of an eye, more than half of the frost dragons were wiped out. That's Spider Queen Rose. On the slope of the basin, Adele, who was riding on a war horse of death, narrowed her eyes. She stared at the eight-legged Spider Queen in the crowd, her eyes seeming to burst into flames. Spider Queen rose. She followed Hermes to war 100,000 years ago and was his #1 general. After Hermes was defeated, he retreated to the Spider Forest. His Majesty, the Divine King, sent her many invitations, but she was unmoved. Now she's actually relying on them? See, Jilly said indignantly. What's so attractive about that Ron fellow? Even the Spider Queen, who's been in seclusion for 100,000 years, is willing to serve him? If it's really Spider Queen Rose, then we'll have to reevaluate the strength of the rebel army. Adele silently stared at the battlefield and took a deep breath. She knew that Spider Queen Rose's loyalty was not to that unknown brat called Ron, but to the Lich King. Could it be that the legends are true? That Ron fellow is really the Lich King's successor? Even Adele, whose heart was as hard as a rock, couldn't help but waver as she muttered to herself. Ha! What Lich King's successor? He's just a swindler. I've received news that Ron fellow isn't an undead. He's a human. See, Jilly's eyes and ears were extremely sharp. When she heard Adele's muttering, she turned her head and stared fiercely at her. Lady Adele, do you believe that the Lich King would pass his inheritance to a human? Or, at this point, see, Jilly paused for a moment and her face sank. She said with a smile that wasn't a smile, "You plan to betray His Majesty the Divine King?" "I definitely won't betray His Majesty the Divine King." Faced with the aggressive Sea Jelly, Adele couldn't help but lose her imposing manner. She knew that behind Sea Jelly was His Majesty the Divine King of Calamity. "It's good that you won't." Sea Jelly faintly smiled, a satisfied expression on her face. She turned her head and proudly said, "Now, the war has already begun. Lady Adele, you know what to do." Adele nodded and made a gesture behind her. Woo! Woo! At this moment, the low sound of a bugle horn rang out and instantly spread throughout the entire battlefield. Attack! Chapter 894. Kill! 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 An army of nearly 1,000,000 charged forward, causing the earth to tremble. The Battle of Hung Ross had officially begun. In this relatively small Hung Ross basin, millions of undead from both sides began an earth-shattering slaughter. A white cloud blocked the morning sun, hiding even the sun, as if it didn't dare to watch this bitter civil war between the undead. Kill! Loltha's undead army was already prepared for battle. They were waiting at ease for the exhausted. Under the command of their commander, they also charged toward the other side. Countless banners fluttered as both sides displayed the blood-red skull battle flag of the Calamity Army from 100,000 years ago. However, the blood-red skull battle flag on Adele's side was a little different. There was a golden crown on top of the terrifying skull. Compared to the blood-red skull battle flag from 100,000 years ago, it had a hint of nobility. The Hung Ross Basin was surrounded by mountains on all sides. The middle was low, while the four sides were high. This terrain made it impossible for Adele's undead army to launch an all-out attack, making up for the lack of numbers on Ron's side. This was also one of the main reasons why Cronia had chosen the Hung Ross Basin as the main battlefield. This was a battle of brute force. There was no room for negotiation between the two sides. The iron hooves of the undead warhorses trampled the earth. Loltha's undead army and death knights were in the lead, followed by the cave spiders, skeletons, and ghouls. Then came the zombies and abominations. The few meat grinders and stone statues were at the rear of the battle formation, providing the army with long-range attacks and healing. Adele was clear in her heart that in front of the sea of cave spiders, the powerful frost dragon would not be able to gain any advantage. Since this was the case, they could only launch a ground attack. Adele was confident that with the advantage of several times their numbers, the other side would definitely be defeated. However, Adele was wrong. Asterisk boom. Asterisk both sides fiercely collided with each other, causing an earth-shattering sound. Under the powerful impact, the soldiers from both sides were sent flying into the air. Before they could even take a breath, the other side had already fiercely charged over with weapons. Adele, who was charging at the front, was quickly surrounded. Killing intent flashed in Adele's hands. She raised the long sword in her hand high, emitting a green light. Powerful death energy erupted, and with a slash, the fearsome knight charging at the front was cut in two. The momentum of the sword didn't stop as it fiercely collided with a Death Knight wielding a two-handed heavy sword. The Death Knight, who was known for his powerful defense, was sent flying. The Death Knight, with powerful defense and recovery ability, was not at all afraid of the enemy's swords. One person and one horse. Adele quickly broke into the enemy's position. Adele rarely went into battle herself, but that didn't mean that she was weak. On the contrary, even when she was a God's Domain expert, her strength was on par with Shayas. After obtaining Tito's Death Godhead, she was like a tiger that had grown wings. While fighting, she felt the Death Godhead in the depths of her soul, continuously transmitting power. What a powerful force! Adele's heart trembled. At this moment, she felt as if she was standing at the peak of the world. Looking around, all the living beings around her were like ants. She could even see their movements clearly and see their strength clearly. This was a god, a high and mighty god, overlooking the lowly creatures from a high place that was difficult for all living things to reach. In the crowd, a pair of beautiful eyes stared at Adele, paying close attention to her every move. I was wondering who it was. So it's that old guy Tito's divinity. Rose secretly observed everything, the corners of her mouth revealing a trace of an imperceptible smile. At this moment, she felt the wind behind her head. A huge hate warrior had appeared behind Rose at some point. Its ugly body, which looked like it was pieced together from pieces of corpses, was constantly flowing with disgusting thick water. It growled, raised the huge long sword in its hand high up, and fiercely slashed down behind Rose. Swish, a sound was heard. Rose was faster than it. 8 spider legs suddenly stretched out from behind her, piercing the hate warrior's heart like sharp swords. Ugh, ugh, ugh. The hate warrior that was stabbed could not make out a clear sound. The ugly mouth on its stomach opened, and it continuously spat out blood. It retreated a few steps, its face a mixture of panic and fear. As Rose slowly retracted her spider legs, its huge body fell down with a loud bang. A sinister smile flashed across Rose's mouth. Immediately after, her body began to transform. Her body suddenly grew several times larger, and her slender hands began to twist and change shape. Not long after, a huge insect-like monster covered in iron armor with 2 huge pincers raised high appeared on the battlefield. A strange and cold aura enveloped the entire battlefield. Oh my god, man. Monster, run! The undead who had never seen Rose's real body were frightened and fled in all directions. Kiki, wanna run? It's not that easy. Rose's eyes flashed, and her huge, sickle-like pincers suddenly stabbed into the ground. Carcass beetles. A crack appeared on the ground, and then countless black bugs burst out like a fountain. These bugs were the size of a small dog and had a hard carapace all over their bodies. Like cockroaches, they supported themselves on the ground with their 6 claws. On their sharp front wings, there were 2 spikes that protruded out, causing one to be intimidated. These carcass beetles were not strong individually, but there were many of them, and they were not afraid of death. They flapped the white, translucent wings on their backs and opened their mouths to bite the undead that were dozens of times stronger than them. The hard front wings crushed the bones, and there were cracking sounds. Asterisk crack. Crack. Asterisk screams came from the front. Oh my god, what is this? Don't bite me. It hurts, leg. My leg. At this moment, Rose activated her charge. She suddenly jumped up, raised her pincers high, and slashed down with the powerful divine energy of death. Crack! A sound was heard. The sharp pincers cut through the heavy armor of the Death Knight and directly cut him in half from his shoulder to his abdomen. Kill! Kill! Rose suddenly broke into the battle formation, and soon she was surrounded by a large group of undead and their summoned undead creatures. However, Rose was not afraid. She brandished her terrifying twin stingers, and charged back and forth in the battlefield. Asterisk whoosh. Asterisk at this moment. A cloud of black fog suddenly appeared behind Rose and turned into the appearance of an undead. At the same time, a sharp dagger ruthlessly stabbed towards Rose's back. The undead assassin's face revealed a sinister smile. He could almost see the sharp dagger piercing her chest from the back and blood splattering everywhere. Unfortunately, dreams were beautiful, but reality was cruel. Asterisk clang. Asterisk, the undead assassin's dagger had just touched the hard carapace on Rose's back when it suddenly rebounded. How could this be? The undead assassin's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. What happened in front of him was far beyond his comprehension. Without waiting for the undead assassin to react, Rose suddenly turned her head, and, as if she had eyes on the back of her head, she sent the undead assassin flying away, strong, too strong. At this moment, Rose was like an indestructible tank, and all obstacles in front of her were eliminated one by one. The powerful divine energy of death, the carapace harder than steel, and the numerous carcass beetles made her invincible on the battlefield. She was the most effective killing machine. Rose, the queen of spiders. Adele sucked in a breath of cold air. She knew that Rose was very strong, but she did not expect her to be this strong. It seems that I have no choice but to act. Adele thought to herself. She rarely fought personally, not because she was weak, but as the commander of the entire battle, she should control the situation of the entire battlefield and control the troops and not fight like crazy soldiers. But now, Rose's appearance had overturned her thoughts. Other than her, no one could stop this god-level steel monster. Screech. In front of Adele, the head of an undead warrior flew into the sky. Blood spurted out, and the body fell down, revealing the terrifying figure of the Queen of Spiders. In the blink of an eye, the two of them discovered each other's existence. Their eyes met, revealing a burning desire to fight. At this moment, a carcass beetle suddenly jumped up, flapping its small wings, and pounced towards Adele with bared fangs and brandished claws. Bang! A loud sound was heard. The carcass beetle's body suddenly exploded, and green blood spilled all over the ground. Adele raised the shield in her hand and stood there as if nothing had happened. This is the Death Knight. Tito's weapon? Rose's pupils shrank. She recognized Tito's long sword and shield. Not to mention other things, these two items were rare divine weapons. That's right. He is my most respected teacher. Adele did not deny it and nodded indifferently. Rose was stunned. In her mind, the scene of the two of them fighting side by side under the Lich King, Hermes, 100,000 years ago appeared. Unfortunately, those days were gone forever. He passed on the godhood to you, right? Rose stared at Adele, as if trying to find an answer from her. Without the godhood, Tito would not be able to live for long. Adele smiled slightly and said indifferently, Your Excellency, Rose, don't you think that this kind of question is a bit superfluous on the battlefield? You're right. Rose's eyes flashed. Her huge body took half a step back, and she put her stingers together like weapons. Her body leaned forward slightly. This was the prelude to an attack. Then let me see how much of that old guy's power you've inherited. Adele's heart trembled. She immediately placed her long sword in front of her chest and hung her shield on her left side. On the chaotic battlefield, the sounds of killing and screams were endless. In the sky, the roars of the frost dragon and the abyss-bone dragon could be heard from time to time. Chapter 895. Banners fluttered in the wind, and battle cries shook the sky. At this moment, the Hung Ross Basin had become a terrifying slaughterhouse. A necromancer kept chanting an obscure incantation, and not long after, ugly and disgusting undead creatures stood up shakily. The necromancer waved the staff in his hand, and those undead creatures rushed forward like hounds that had seen blood. At this time, a strange black shadow quietly approached. Bang! A bright light flashed, and a large head flew up into the sky, spurting out a 3-meter-tall column of blood at the moment of the attack. the undead assassin revealed himself. He looked contemptuously at the fallen corpse, and the corner of his mouth curved into a sinister smile. At this time, he suddenly felt pain in his chest, and when he looked down, he saw a sharp long sword piercing his chest from his back. The undead assassin's eyes showed strong disbelief, and his body swayed before finally falling down powerlessly. Countless such scenes played out on the battlefield. In the Hung Ross Basin, both sides had invested nearly 1,000,000 troops. Every inch of land, every trench had been repeatedly fought over, and blood had dyed the ground red, forming small puddles one after another. Although the undead army led by Rose was much smaller than Adele's army, with only a little over 1,000,000 people, they fought very tenaciously. They were like a steel wall condensed from blood, stubbornly blocking Adele's army of more than 6,000,000, unable to take a step forward. On the ground, the fierce battle continued, and the battle in the air was especially fierce. Both sides threw in hundreds of thousands of frost dragons, tens of thousands of abyssal bone dragons, and hundreds of thousands of elite gargoyles, forming a dense dark cloud in the sky. Boom, boom, boom. On the other side of the battlefield, Death Knight Adele and Spider Queen Rose were fighting back and forth. Both sides were evenly matched in strength, and for a time, they were in a deadlock. The collision of divine powers caused a large number of sparks to erupt, burning the fighting spirit and lighting up the entire sky. Clang! Adele fiercely slashed her sword at Rose's back. The rebounding force from Rose's hard carapace caused her hand to hurt. The chariot of death under her was unable to withstand the powerful force and was forced to retreat a few steps. What a powerful defense! The more Adele fought, the more frightened she became. She couldn't believe that even though she had inherited Lord Tito's divinity, she was still lacking in strength. She didn't know that 100,000 years ago, the Spider Queen's notoriety had far surpassed Tito's. Although Rose's hard carapace had blocked Adele's longsword, Adele's powerful strength had still caused her great pain. She let out a low growl and slashed at Adele. The distance was too close for Adele to dodge. She had no choice but to roll on the ground and dodge Rose's heavy attack that contained the divine energy of death. Boom! Rose's hands, which had transformed into a pair of stingers, smashed into the ground with a loud bang. Adele only felt the ground tremble as a pale green radiance spread out. With Rose as the center, cracks spread out like a spiderweb. The surrounding undead soldiers seemed to have been struck by lightning as they stood there in a daze. Slowly, blood flowed out from the corners of their mouths as they were shaken to death. Although she was in a sorry state, Adele was still lucky enough to dodge Rose's heavy attack. However, her mount, the chariot of death, wasn't so lucky. How could the carrion beetles that Rose had summoned let go of this opportunity? They swarmed over. In the blink of an eye, not even a skeleton was left. What a terrifying strength! Adele was overwhelmed with shock. She had made sufficient mental preparations for this battle, but she had still underestimated Rose's strength. Although you have inherited Tito's power and have been promoted to a god, there is still a difference in strength between gods. Rose smiled coldly. She didn't stop moving her feet. Her 6 gigantic limbs moved quickly and pounced towards Adele. Her speed wasn't inferior to that of a galloping warhorse. Die! At this moment, Rose had already rushed in front of Adele. She raised her huge pair of stingers and smashed them fiercely. Come! Adele, who had lost her warhorse, didn't want to be outdone. She raised her shield and once again clashed with Rose. Boom! 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 This was a battle between gods. Because both sides were using the power of death, every collision caused the air to tremble. In terms of body size, the Crypt Lord Rose was nearly twice as big as the Death Knight Adele. However, her whole body was covered in a hard carapace. Her body was heavy and indestructible. Similarly, the Death Knight Adele was known for her defensive power. Her martial arts were excellent, and she had an additional evil halo. As long as her injuries weren't too serious, she could recover in an instant. However, in terms of overall strength, Rose still had the upper hand. She forced Adele to retreat step by step. The battle was reaching its climax. As more and more undead soldiers entered the battlefield, the undead on Rose's side gradually lost. Damn it! Rose also saw this scene, and her heart sank. In a grand battle between heroes, victory or defeat greatly affected morale, but didn't play a decisive role. Even if Rose's strength was greater than Adele's, if her army was wiped out by the enemy, she alone wouldn't be able to salvage the situation. Although she had been beaten into a sorry state by Rose, Adele knew that as long as she could hold on and not lose, they would definitely win this battle. After destroying the undead army in the Hengroth Basin, the Forgotten City was like a young woman who had been stripped naked in front of the scourge. Huff, 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 ha, surrender. With your little strength, how can you contend against His Majesty, the Divine King? Adele panted heavily as she spoke to Rose. At this moment, a rare smile appeared on her face. You're talking about Fismare? Rose's eyes narrowed. Sorry, I have no interest in that guy. Us crypt spiders are only loyal to the Lich King. His Majesty the Divine King is the true successor of the Lich King, Adele said resolutely. Unfortunately, I've never admitted this. Even after 100,000 years, Rose smiled and said seriously, however, the true successor of the Lich King has already appeared. He's in the Forgotten City, and you guys are just rebels under the banner of the Scourge. Ha ha ha. You're talking about that human called Ron? Adele laughed when she heard this. Since when did us undead need to be loyal to a lowly human? His Majesty the Divine King. Only His Majesty the Divine King can revive the undead race. He's the hope of all undead, Adele said, a trace of fanaticism in her eyes. Save this nonsense for His Majesty the Divine King, Rose said disapprovingly. She couldn't be bothered to argue with Adele now. Adele pointed around and sneered. Do you think you still have a chance? Relying on their advantage in numbers, Adele's army began to divide and encircle Rose's army. The balance of the battle gradually tilted toward Adele's side. Even so, I'll kill you first. Rose's eyes flashed with killing intent as she pounced towards Adele. Very good, come. Chapter 896. The Battle of Talas had reached its climax. Shouts shook the heavens and earth, and in the boundless Talas Basin, millions of soldiers fought like ants. All sorts of undead magic was used on the battlefield, and skeletons, ghouls, terranites, abominations, and other undead creatures crisscrossed. Because both sides were undead, it was difficult to tell who was who. Everyone's eyes were red with killing intent, and in the sky, injured gargoyles, abyssal bone dragons, and other undead creatures fell to the ground like meteors. The battle was as fierce as ever. However, at this moment, no one noticed that two unrelated figures had quietly appeared on the battlefield. They were a man and a woman, one tall and one short. They stood on the edge of a small mountain in the northwest of the basin, quietly overlooking the battlefield. The tall one was a male angel with golden hair. He was wearing a bright silver armor, and his deep-set eyes revealed a pair of blue eyes. Behind him, a pair of golden wings gently flapped, and he had a cold expression on his face. He was Hardadef, and after leaving the Forgotten City with the shame of being an angel, he had secretly returned here. Standing beside Hardadef was a young female angel. She was wearing a pure white female robe, and her collar and cuffs were embroidered with golden patterns. Her long golden hair was gently pulled up before falling down like a waterfall to her waist. She had an extremely perfect face without any blemishes, and under her long eyelashes, her beautiful sapphire-like eyes flickered with the light of wisdom. Like Hardadef, the wings on this female angel's back were also golden. They were quietly folded behind her, and she gave off an awe-inspiring and noble aura. As Hardadef watched the battle in front of him, he gradually clenched his fists, causing them to make cracking sounds. He gritted his teeth, his body trembling, and his eyes looked as if they were about to spit out flames. Humiliation, a deep humiliation, When Hardadef returned to the battlefield, his heart was filled with shame and helplessness. Although the battle between the undead in front of him was fierce, it was far inferior to that of the angels. Hardadef could not imagine that the angel army he led would be defeated by these inferior undead, becoming the laughingstock of the entire main plane of order. The female angel next to Hardadef glanced at him and smiled before quickly looking away as she softly said, "Hardadef, you still haven't let it go." This female angel's appearance was extremely beautiful, and even her voice was as pleasant as the sounds of nature. "Lady Emily." John took a step back and knelt down, saying with his blood-red eyes, "Lady Emily, please give me another chance. This time, I will definitely lead the angel army to flatten the forgotten city." This extremely beautiful female angel was none other than head angel Emily of the Legion of Holy Angels. The Legion of Holy Angels under her command was second only to the Legion of Holy Angels in the Order Plane. John was only the deputy commander of the Holy Light Angel Army. If he wanted to mobilize the Angel Army, he needed Emily's permission. Sigh. Emily sighed and looked at Johann. "Johann, did you think we came here for the Forgotten City?" John was stunned. He raised his head and said in astonishment, "Could it be that it isn't?" "Of course not." Emily shook her head. "I'm just curious about the strength of the undead. Although I don't understand your actions, I think that since you made the decision to retreat, it should be the right thing to do. I just want to know the reason." The corner of John's mouth twitched. He stood up and harumphed coldly. "They're just too lucky. Don't forget, the Forgotten City has always been in the hands of the orcs. Before this, we already fought a battle with the Frostwolf Legion. But don't forget, luck is also a part of strength." Before John could finish speaking, Emily rudely interrupted him. "The outcome of a battle doesn't mean anything, John. Why can't you see past it? I just don't want to accept it." John sighed. He turned to look at the battlefield, anger surging in his heart once more. If it were another legion, it would be fine. But these undead, these lowly undead. Emily shook her head and didn't say anything else. At this moment, her eyes fell on Rose. After a long while, she slowly spoke. "I didn't think that she would actually leave the Spider Forest. Looks like the news is true. The successor of the Lich King has finally appeared. Other than the Lich King, the Spider Queen will not be loyal to anyone else." "The Lich King?" John laughed disapprovingly. "He's just a human brat who's still wet behind the ears. The Lich King of the Scourge Legion is actually a human." "Ha! This is the biggest joke in the world. To think that these undead would believe it. To be able to be chosen by Hermes, there must be something special about him. Even if he's a human." Emily laughed. "You fought him before, and you didn't have the upper hand either, did you?" "Humph. Who knows where he picked up the Scourge staff?" John said unhappily, but the uneasiness in his eyes exposed his thoughts. Emily smiled, but didn't say anything. To be able to obtain the inheritance of the Lich King and the loyalty of the Spider Queen as a human. How could that human called Ron be so simple? Emily glanced at the Death Knight that was fighting with Rose, but she didn't recognize her. She couldn't help but be stunned and frowned. "Strange. Who is this person? Why don't I have any information on her?" "It's not Tito." Because of the distance, John had to open his eyes wide to see the other person's face clearly. He immediately became nervous. A female Death Knight. What the hell? An undead actually became a god. How is this possible? In the main plane, it was no secret how many deities each force had. However, the sudden addition of a deity was no small matter. It was extremely difficult for a deity's domain powerhouse to become a deity. There might not even be a single deity in 10,000 years. Going from god-level fighter to god was a qualitative leap, and with the Altar of Heroes, one could even live forever. According to the information that Emily had, in the entire main plane of the undead, there were only 4 god-level fighters. The Scourge Emperor Fismai, the Dreadlord Saruman, the Death Knight Tito, and the Spider Queen Rose, who lived in seclusion in the Spider Forest. Even if Ron appeared out of nowhere, there were only 5 gods, which was relatively small in the main plane, and this was also why the undead were the weakest. Just the legion of holy angels alone, including herself, had 8 god-level fighters. 100,000 years ago, when the legion of holy angels was at its peak, there were more than 30 god-level angels. But unfortunately, most of them fell in the first battle of the main plane. No, this guy's power is a little familiar. Wait, let me think. As Emily spoke, she closed her eyes and concentrated on thinking. After a while, she opened her eyes. I understand. She's using Tito's power. No wonder it's so familiar. Emily smiled. Tito must have inherited his divinity to her and forcibly created a god. But this way, Tito must have fallen. Without his divinity, he can't have the altar of heroes. And if he dies, he's really dead. That guy inherited Tito's divinity, but didn't completely inherit his power. Looks like the Spider Queen side will win. Seeing Adele being beaten back by Rose, John revealed a mocking smile. To him, the undead on both sides were enemies, and it was best for them to kill each other. But this battle is going to be lost. With the great disparity in numbers, the undead on Physmai's side had completely suppressed the other side, and victory was only a matter of time. Even if Rose killed that god, it wouldn't change the outcome of defeat. Chapter 897. Bang! A loud sound was heard. Adele's body flew into the air and fell to the ground, spitting out a mouthful of blood. Quick! Protect the lady! Seeing that Adele was in a disadvantageous situation, her subordinates pounced on the terrifying monster without regard for their own safety. You don't know the difference between life and death. Do you think you can interfere in a battle between gods? The spider Empress Lolth sneered. With a wave of her stingers, an abomination was sliced in half and exploded like a ball of meat. Blood and intestines flowed all over the ground. She then turned around and rammed into a death knight, sending it flying. At this moment, Spider Queen Lolth was like an invincible god, clearing away the undead blocking her way. In just a moment, she had killed dozens of people. Whether it was the thick-skinned abominations or the death knights, known for their defense, they were no match for her. As for the low-level skeletons, Lolth didn't even look at them and directly ran over them. Protect the lady! Protect the lady! An undead warrior desperately pounced on the back of Rose's carapace and pulled with all his might. When the other undead saw this, they all pounced on Rose. Some pulled, some hit, and some tried their best to stop Rose from moving forward. One of the undead assassins took out a poison dagger out of nowhere and ruthlessly stabbed it through a gap in Rose's carapace. Lolth screamed in pain. What she hated the most in her life was people climbing on her back. Die. All of you die. Lolth was so angry that she almost went berserk. She slammed her stingers on the ground, and a powerful divine power of death shot up into the sky. Bang, bang, bang. In an instant, countless spikes extended from Lolth's back and ruthlessly pierced into the bodies of the undead. Cluck, cluck, cluck. Seeing this terrifying scene, Adele felt her body freeze. Her eyes were wide open, and her face was full of fear. She could clearly hear the sound of her teeth chattering. What a terrifying monster this was. Even if she had inherited Teacher Tito's divinity, she still wasn't a match for this monster. Lolth quickly dealt with the undead blocking her way. She dashed in front of Adele, raised her huge stingers, and ruthlessly cut them. Die! Adele closed her eyes in despair. At this moment, she felt a warm current from the depths of her soul, quickly flowing through her entire body. In an instant, all of Adele's injuries were healed. This is the power of a mentor. Adele was both surprised and delighted. At this critical juncture, Tito's godhead burst out with a cyan radiance, instantly merging with Adele's power. At this moment, she opened her eyes, just in time to see a black shadow bearing down on her with a monstrous momentum. The shadow of death immediately shrouded her heart. Adele grabbed something next to her. She didn't know what it was, but she swung it fiercely. An earth-shattering scream was heard. A sword light flashed, and Rose's right arm was cut into two. Blood spurted out from her severed arm. Rose took a few steps back, her face filled with disbelief. Thump, thump, thump. Impossible, impossible. At this moment of life and death, Adele felt that Tito's godhead had completely fused with her own power. In other words, she had completely inherited Tito's godhead. It's the mentor. The mentor saved me. Adele stood up abruptly, feeling the powerful energy gushing out from the depths of her soul. For a moment, her courage increased 100-fold. She gritted her teeth and walked towards Rose in large strides. What are you doing?" Rose's face was filled with shock and anger. Even if Adele had fused with Tito's godhead, Rose could still fight. However, she was too careless and allowed Adele to succeed. At this moment, she was seriously injured and her power was plummeting. Adele didn't say a word. The long sword in her hand drew a streak of light. Another scream was heard. One of Rose's forelimbs was cut off. Her heavy body fell heavily to the ground. Her body slowly reverted to its original form, a beautiful woman with a severed right arm. "Spider Empress, to think that you would have such a day." Adele grinned maliciously and raised her sword. "You want to kill me?" Rose quickly calmed down and smiled. "Unfortunately, you can't kill me. I'm a god. I can revive." "Revive?" Adele sneered and pointed at the forgotten city behind her. "If I destroy your dark altar, what will happen?" A trace of fear finally appeared on Rose's face. "Go to hell." Adele waved her long sword and chopped down on Rose's head. Bang! At this moment, a black shadow suddenly appeared beside Rose. This black shadow raised two pitch-black daggers and blocked Adele's longsword. Although it blocked Adele's longsword, the powerful death energy still caused her to vomit blood and retreat. The black shadow didn't dare to continue fighting. She grabbed Rose and ran. "Damn it, where do you think you're going?" Adele flew into a rage out of humiliation. No one would have thought that an undead assassin with only the strength of a god would be able to save her enemy right under her nose. She immediately chased after her. "It's you." Rose was stupefied. She saw a pale face under the shabby hood. It was Cronia. A trace of blood slowly flowed down from the corner of her mouth. "Thank you." Rose didn't know if it was because of the defeat just now, but her heart was slightly moved. She, who had always been arrogant, actually gave her rare thanks. Cronia stared blankly at first. Then she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Lady Rose, let's talk about this later. We still haven't escaped." Rose turned around and saw that Adele had snatched a death charger from somewhere and was chasing after her. "This guy is really hard to deal with." Rose cursed. If she hadn't been careless and suffered heavy injuries with her personality, she would have definitely turned around and fought with her life on the line. Even if she died in battle, it didn't matter. In any case, the Dark Altar could revive her. But now that Ron wasn't here, she was the only god in the entire Forgotten City. If she died in battle, then the Forgotten City wouldn't be able to protect itself. Cronia also understood this point, so she risked her life to save her. "Lady Cronia." Just as she was speaking, Hunter came up to her with a staff. Since Cronia was no longer the leader of the Shadow Thieves, Hunter didn't call her Lord Leader. "Block that guy behind me." Cronia took a deep breath and said. Hunter glanced at Adele behind him, a determined look in his eyes. "Yes, Lady Cronia." Originally, Hainder's strength was still okay, but his luck wasn't too good. He ran into a god like Adele, and the undead creatures he summoned were easily destroyed. Even the strongest skeleton monarch was cut in half by Adele's blade. If he hadn't run fast enough, he would have lost his life. At this moment, Adele was like a god of death. No matter who stood in front of her, they would be chopped into pieces by her sword. She had already made up her mind to kill Rose, whether it was for the sake of this war or for the sake of His Majesty the Emperor. Rose was heavily injured, so this was the best opportunity to kill her. Adele did not forget that there was another, even more powerful god in Forgotten City eyeing her covetously. At this moment, an earth-shattering battle cry came from the direction of the Forgotten City. Smoke and dust billowed as an undead army charged out. The one in the lead was Shea. She went straight to meet Adele. "Another one?" Adele frowned as she looked at Shea in front of her. She wasn't afraid of this Death Knight, who only had the strength of a god's domain. Shea also went to meet her without any misgivings. Boom! The swords of the two sides fiercely collided with each other, causing a huge explosion. Powerful death energy burst out in all directions. Shea finally succeeded in stopping Adele, this killing god, and also took a step back. A human? Shea was fine, but Adele was shocked. Although the opponent's strength couldn't compare to hers, she was very powerful. She was even more powerful than she was before she inherited Tito's divinity. Shea's goal was to delay Adele and save Rose. Although she was much stronger than Hinder, it was still impossible for her to stop a god. Soon, she was beaten back again and again, adding a few more wounds to her body. Adele raised her eyebrows. Suddenly, she saw a flash of light in front of her. It turned out that a sword had fiercely chopped down from the sky. She hurriedly tilted her head and blocked the sneak attack of the sword. When she saw the person who had launched the sneak attack, she couldn't help but be stunned. An angel? What appeared in front of Adele was an angel with two wings on her back. However, unlike the angel she had seen before, this angel's wings were black, and her eyes were also black. It looked very strange. The fallen angel Alice had also appeared on the battlefield at this moment. Together with Shea, they blocked Adele's path. Isn't this Alice? John, who was far away on the hillside, recognized his beloved subordinate at a glance. A trace of astonishment flashed through his eyes. She actually became a fallen angel? Legend has it that when the heart of an angel is infected by evil energy, they will become a fallen angel. From there, they will obtain even more powerful and brutal power. Emily seemed to be used to it. Although it's a pity, Alice isn't the first, and she won't be the last. John nodded. To a high and mighty god like him, an angel with only the strength of the divine realm was not worth mentioning. He turned his gaze to the battlefield. Strange? Why hasn't the hero of the Forgotten City come out yet? Emily frowned. She looked at John with an expression of disbelief. Shea and Alice together were not Adele's match, but they succeeded in blocking Adele's path. Seeing Alice run further and further away, Adele's face became gloomy. At this moment, a bugle horn sounded. This was the signal to retreat. Let's go. Shea made a gesture to Alice and said in a low voice. Alice nodded, and with a flap of her wings, she flew into the air. After hearing the long bugle horn sound, the undead of the Forgotten City began to retreat, while the undead of the other side took the opportunity to charge forward. The entire battlefield was in chaos. Adele was about to give the order to pursue, but she suddenly thought of something. Her heart trembled, and she immediately ordered the scourge to stop. As soon as the order was issued, Scarlet rushed over in a flustered and exasperated manner. She asked, "Why did you stop chasing?" Adele glanced at Scarlet, and a trace of disgust flashed in her eyes. "There's no reason. Military governor, this is my duty. You have no right to ask." "No right to ask?" Scarlet sneered. "That's right. I can't interfere with your duty. But now is a great opportunity to destroy the enemy, and you let it go so easily." "Huh? Could it be that Lady Adele has other plans?" Scarlet narrowed her eyes, staring at Adele like a poisonous snake. Adele frowned. The reason she gave the order to stop chasing was because she was afraid of another person. In the Forgotten City, Rose was not the only god. Since they had won the Battle of Talas, they should stop while they were ahead. Fighting steadily and surely was her character. To destroy the rebels of the Forgotten City was not something that could be done in a day or two. Adele did not want to explain, especially in front of Scarlet. She rolled her eyes. "Think whatever you want." "Good, good." Scarlet's eyes seemed to burst into flames. She knew that she could not do anything to Adele, so she could only fiercely stomp her feet. "Just you wait." After saying that, she left in a huff. Adele looked at Scarlet's back as she left, and her face gradually became serious. Chapter 898. It was a peaceful night. Tents covered almost the entire Hengros plains. Ever since Adele won the Battle of Hengros, The Hengros Plains had become the domain of the Scourge. In the camp, bonfires rose. The undead soldiers gathered in groups of 2s and 3s, eating dinner and talking about the intense battle today. From time to time, 1 or 2 painful groans could be heard from the tightly closed tent. Lady Adele, Commander-in-Chief. Adele walked through the camp. The undead soldiers of the Scourge stood up and saluted her, their expressions full of respect. Adele nodded indifferently. It was her habit to inspect the camp's defenses at night. If they were ambushed by the enemy at night, it would be over. "Is there any movement over there?" Adele asked indifferently. Her every movement now had a sense of majesty. "Reporting to my lady, there is no movement from the Forgotten City." An undead assassin saluted and replied, "But I was discovered just as I approached the city wall. It wasn't easy for me to escape." Adele sized up the undead assassin. Seeing the wounds on his body that had just healed, she nodded and said, "You may leave." "Yes, Lady Adele." The undead assassin saluted and turned to leave. Adele looked in the direction of the Forgotten City, her face revealing a thoughtful expression. "It shouldn't be? Why hasn't that Ron appeared yet?" Recalling that Ron called himself the Lich King, Adele's heart was filled with unwillingness and fear. But then she gritted her teeth and secretly made up her mind. Regardless of whether he was the Lich King or not, she must kill that guy. At this time, an undead woman walked to Adele's side and said expressionlessly, "Commander-in-Chief, Miss C. Jilly invites you over." C. Jilly? The person who came was C. Jilly's maid, but Adele didn't have a good impression of C. Jilly. She shook her head and said, "Go back and tell the military governor that I'm patrolling the camp and have no time." Seeing that Adele refused, the maid's expression didn't change. Miss C. Jilly said that it wasn't her idea to invite you over, but His Majesty the Divine King wants to see me. When Adele heard the maid's words, she was shocked. She muttered to herself, "Lead the way." The maid brought Adele to a huge, luxurious tent, lifted the curtain, and made an inviting gesture. Adele walked in with her head held high. This was Scarlett's temporary tent. The furnishings in the tent were somewhat simple. There was a bed and a table. Scarlett was originally sitting on the ground, but when she saw Adele walk in, she stood up and looked at her with a smile that was not a smile. "His Majesty is here. Explain it to him personally." "His Majesty is here?" Adele frowned. She didn't understand what Scarlett meant. His Majesty the Divine Emperor was far away in Ice Crown Castle, so why would he come to the battlefield? However, Scarlett didn't explain to her. Instead, she turned around and went out. Pum! Just then, a cloud of black mist suddenly rose from the table. Adele then saw that there was a simple magic array carved on the table. The black fog grew thicker and thicker, gradually transforming into the shape of a person. "Your Majesty." When Adele saw this, she immediately knelt down and saluted. It was not the godly Emperor Calamity who had come. It was only the godly Emperor's clone. "Rise!" The godly Emperor Fismare wore a light green robe and appeared in front of Adele in the form of a shadow. He looked Adele up and down and said indifferently, "Adele, why did you stop attacking? I think you have to give me an explanation." When Adele heard this, she understood. It turned out that Scarlett had already reported the entire matter to the godly Emperor. She could imagine how Scarlett had exaggerated all of this in front of the godly Emperor. When Adele heard His Majesty's question, there was a trace of dissatisfaction in his voice. "It's like this, Your Majesty." Adele stood up and explained the ins and outs of the matter to the godly Emperor Calamity. The reason she had stopped attacking was first because she didn't know the details of the other side. Second, the army needed to rest after a series of fierce battles. Third, she had fought a battle with the spider Empress Lolth. Although she had been lucky enough to win, she had consumed a lot of energy, so after winning the Battle of Talas, she had stopped the pursuit. Adele was good at summarizing things. Even the godly Emperor couldn't find any mistakes in her explanation. The godly Emperor Calamity was an extremely suspicious person. No matter how clear Adele's explanation was, he couldn't let it go. Ron's appearance had thrown him into confusion. For the past 100,000 years, Fismer had always considered himself the successor of Hermes. Although he lacked the Calamity Staff as a token, no matter if it was Serene, Tito, or Lolth, no one was more qualified than him to inherit this position. Except for this Ron who had appeared out of nowhere and held the Calamity Staff. This was something Fismer absolutely couldn't tolerate. In Fismer's eyes, this new Ron was even more dangerous than Saruman, who had fought for 100,000 years. He had recklessly attacked the Forgotten City, but he hadn't thought that this great mission would be rejected by Tito. The reason was that he wouldn't make a move against the Lich King. This made the godly Emperor Fismer even more furious. Even though Hermes had been dead for 100,000 years, he still had an extremely high prestige among the undead. Fismer muttered to himself, "No matter what, the army must move quickly. I didn't give you so many troops just to enjoy the scenery in Hakant." "Yes, your majesty." Adele could only bite the bullet and reply. As the highest commander of the Calamity Army, she was somewhat dissatisfied with the godly emperor's interference. Fismer nodded indifferently. He glanced at Adele. "That's right, when you were fighting today. Did you see the human called Ron? How strong is he? Is he holding the Calamity Staff?" Adele was startled. After hesitating for a moment, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, your majesty. I didn't see that human, and I don't know what the Calamity Staff is." The Calamity Staff is a unique divine weapon. It has 4 large skulls, and below each skull is a string of smaller skulls. During battle, these skulls will turn and make strange sounds. Fismer described the Calamity Staff to Adele in detail. At this moment, a trace of fanaticism appeared in his eyes. "Adele, if you see it, you must bring it back for me." "Yes, your majesty." Fismer nodded in satisfaction. "Adele, originally the commander of this battle should have been Tito, but he recommended you to me. Therefore, I hope that you can fight this battle well. When you return victorious after conquering the Forgotten City, I will give you the highest honor on the throne of the Ice-Crown Castle." Adele's heart was filled with excitement. She immediately knelt down on one knee. "Yes, Adele will definitely not disappoint your majesty." Fismer encouraged Adele a few more times before turning into a cloud of black mist and disappearing. The Forgotten City was brightly lit throughout the night. Squads of undead soldiers walked through the streets. The streets were under curfew, and all the undead were tense, ready for any sudden battle. In the Hall of the Undead, Rose, Shea, Cronia, and the others were silent. The millions of undead soldiers stationed in the Hengroth Basin were like a huge rock that weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. "Is there still no news from Ron?" Rose opened her eyes and asked. She waved her hand and dismissed the undead witch doctor who had been treating her. "No," Cronius said. "If he comes back, he definitely won't stand by and watch today's situation without doing anything. It's my fault." Rose's face was full of regret. "If I had told him the name of that divine beast, perhaps he wouldn't. Forget it." Seeing Rose fight so hard today, Shea's prejudice towards Rose vanished. She sighed. "There are many things that can't be predicted. You don't have to take it to heart." Although the undead main plane was huge, there were as many mutated beasts as there were hairs on a cow. In order to expand their living space, it was necessary to eliminate those powerful mutated beasts. Ron and that undead dragon would have a battle sooner or later. "Thank you." Rose glanced at Shea, a trace of gratitude in her eyes. Although her hand had already healed, she still looked a little dispirited. Her strength had yet to recover. Cronia looked at the two of them and sighed in relief. "What's in front of us now? What should we do next?" "What else can we do? Tomorrow, I'll charge again and let those guys have a taste of Rose's power." Rose coldly snorted, a trace of killing intent appearing on her face. It wasn't that she couldn't defeat Adele, she was just a little careless. Today's failure made her extremely unwilling. "No!" Rose's suggestion was vetoed by Shea. Although the enemy's strength is about the same as ours, their military strength is more than double ours. We'll be at a disadvantage if we charge head-on. Shea shook her head. My suggestion is to rely on the advantageous terrain of Forgotten City to defend. Defend? Cronia muttered to herself, thinking that this was also a good idea. Forgotten City had built so many ghost towers and spider towers. If the enemy dared to come, regardless of whether they were in the sky or underground, it would be enough to make them suffer. This is also a good idea, Cronia said. Although the defense is good, it's too passive. Rose frowned. Don't forget, Forgotten City is our main city. Even if we can resist the enemy's attack, the buildings and residents in the city will inevitably suffer losses. Of course I know that. Cronia sighed, but now, there's really no other way. The enemy is just too strong. It's an army of 6 million. Even if they fill it with people, they'll probably fill it up with Physmai's personality. It's not strange for him to do this. Rose stroked her chin, a thoughtful expression on her face. It seems that the appearance of Ron and the Calamity God's staff has made him unable to sit still. Now, we can only defend Forgotten City to the death and wait for Ron to return. Shea sighed. She hesitated for a moment, moved her mouth, and finally said, if there's really no other way, then we can only give up on Forgotten City. Give up on Forgotten City? Chapter 899. Stars dotted the sky as the curtain of night enveloped the earth. The temperature had dropped to freezing point, and a layer of frost had formed on the grass. Lady Emily, should we continue watching? Johann asked softly as he walked to Emily's side on a small hill, facing the bone-piercing cold wind. That's right. Emily opened her eyes. She was currently sitting on a rock on the hill. From here, she could see the camp below Adele's army. Johann frowned. For the two of them, important figures of the Holy Light Angel Corps, it was not a wise decision to put aside what they were doing to watch the battle between the undead. Lady Emily, you seem to be very interested in that fellow called Ron. Johann asked after thinking for a while. Emily sighed slightly and nodded. Yes, to be precise, I'm a bit worried. Worried? A trace of astonishment flashed through Johann's eyes. He did not think that the word worried would come from the mouth of the Holy Light Angel Emily. Johann had once lost to Ron, but he had always thought that it was just a fluke. He had wanted to lead the angel army back to the Forgotten City countless times to wash away the humiliation of that battle, but he had been stopped by Emily. What are you worried about? I'm worried that this human will become the new Lich King. I heard you say that he used the Calamity God staff when he fought with you. It's just a divine weapon. Johann waved his hand. Perhaps his strength is increased by a certain degree through the divine weapon, but that's not a big deal. No, the Calamity God staff is not just a divine weapon. Emily shook her head and said, the Calamity God staff is the symbol of the Calamity Army. Although Physmai inherited the Calamity Army, he was never acknowledged by the undead. Because of this reason, that's why they split into the Calamity Army and the Plague Army. Johann nodded. I know this, but what does it matter? Even if the undead are unified, they are still undead. Our angel army is not even afraid of the demon army in the main plane of hell. So why would we be afraid of these undead? You don't understand at all. Under the leadership of the Lich King, the unified undead will explode with great power. Emily said with a trace of fear in her eyes. Johann fell silent. He did not participate in that battle, and no one dared to mention it. In the entire main plane of order, that battle was a secret. What happened in the war 100,000 years ago? Hardadef took a deep breath and asked. 100,000 years ago. Emily sighed as she gazed into the distant night sky. Her thoughts drifted into her memories. The situation 100,000 years ago was different from now. At that time, the strongest forces in the main plane were the Calamity Army in the main plane of the undead and the Legion of Holy Angels in the main plane of order. Our Holy Light Angel Army was just a small army under the shadow of the Legion of Holy Angels. Oh, right. There was no alliance of justice or alliance of evil back then. The beginning of that dimensional war was also an accident. At that time, all the major armies were keen to develop their own forces in the secondary planes. In that secondary plane called Omros, the Legion of Holy Angels and the Calamity Army had a conflict. Amros, Johann said in surprise. Yes, Amros. Emily nodded. If Michael did not mention it to me, I would have almost forgotten this name. The cause of the incident seems to be that Michael sent an angel to the secondary plane to kill a representative of Hermes. Then, he allied with the native forces and destroyed a force called the Scourge Church. Oh, Johann's eyes showed a hint of surprise. Then Hermes would not let this matter rest, right? Of course. If he could take this lying down, he would not be Hermes. Emily laughed. He quickly led the Calamity army back and happened to meet Michael's angel army. Both sides broke out in that place called Amros. Johann listened with fascination. And the result? Which side won? No one won. Emily shook her head. They only destroyed that secondary plane called Amros. The war between the Legion of Holy Angels and the Calamity army spread from the secondary plane to the main plane. The main plane formed the Alliance of Justice, led by the Legion of Holy Angels, and the Alliance of Evil, led by the Calamity army. Great battles broke out between the Allied forces, and all the major forces were forced to get involved. At this point, Emily looked down and smiled. Compared to the earth-shattering planar war 100,000 years ago, this battle between undead creatures was nothing more than a small skirmish. Forced to get involved? Then our Holy Light Angel army also. Johann paused for a moment and laughed. Can't we choose to be neutral? No. Emily shook her head without hesitation. At that time, there was no such thing as neutrality in the main plane. If we did not join either side, we would only be waiting for death. Our Holy Light Angel army could only join the Alliance of Justice. Otherwise, not to mention the Calamity army, even Michael would not let us go. The reason is simple. No force would give others the chance to stab them in the back. Johann inhaled a breath of cold air and laughed. Fortunately, we joined the Alliance of Justice and defeated them. It's not that simple. Emily sighed. Actually, you're wrong. When the Alliance of Justice was first established, they were always suppressed by the Alliance of Evil. After all, the Calamity army was too powerful. Just thinking about the undead everywhere makes one's heart tremble. No one could resist those crazy undead. The elves of the life main plane were defeated. The elementals of the elemental main plane were defeated. The dwarves' iron furnace fort was almost razed to the ground by the Calamity army. The king of the hills fled with his defeated army. The giants were exterminated. The Legion of Holy Angels was defeated. Our Holy Light Angel army was defeated. The two angel armies of glory and him were annihilated in the Holy Garden of Eden. The Holy Mountain fell. Then the armies of the Alliance of Evil gathered in the main plane of order and besieged the city amongst the clouds. This was the final battle. The soul-stirring battle was narrated by Emily. Even though he knew the final outcome of the battle, it still made Heart-to-Death shudder with fear. Johann's mouth was full of bitterness. The final battle. How was it? I don't know either. To Johann's surprise, Emily shook her head and gave an answer that left him at a loss. Everything happened too suddenly. I suddenly heard the news that the Lich King, Hermes, had died in battle. Then, the billions of undead in the Calamity army were thrown into chaos. We took the opportunity to counterattack and defeated the Calamity army. Without the Calamity army, the Alliance of Evil was like a frame that had lost its support. Johann nodded. He knew what happened after that. The elves, elementals, dwarves, and other races returned to their homes. The Calamity army was divided. Saruman led his undead army and left the ice-crowned castle, forming an independent plague army. The orcs took advantage of the chaos to seize Hakant in the main plane of the undead. No matter what, we won in the end, Johann said with a lingering fear. Emily shook her head. There was no winner in this battle. In fact, there was something that Emily didn't say. It was only after the Legion of Holy Angels had fallen that the Holy Light Angel Corps had grown strong. It could be said that they were the true winners in the battle 100,000 years ago. Emily continued, but what I don't understand is Hermes' sudden death. This was impossible at the time. It's a pity that my level was too low, and I couldn't know about this secret. Johann slapped his head. That's right. Even if the Lich King had died in battle, He could have used the dark altar to revive. Why? Emily's eyes flashed. This isn't the strangest thing. The strangest thing is that I haven't seen Michael since the end of this battle. Johann was stunned. That's not right. Didn't we see him last month? That was only his projection. What did you see his real body? Emily said calmly. What this? Johann's pupils shrank and his mouth opened wide. Sir, come in, Adele said. The undead soldier said a few words beside Adele. What? Adele's expression changed, and she was overjoyed. Chapter 900. The sky had just begun to brighten when a black object streaked across the sky, breaking the tranquility of the morning. A massive explosion sounded out from the Forgotten City's gates as the crumpled-up corpse smashed against the sturdy gates, causing a massive explosion. The rebel army is about to attack. On the Forgotten City's walls, the undead soldiers' terrified screams sounded out. From one of the captives, Adele had heard that Ron was not in the Forgotten City. Her worries were immediately dispelled, and she ordered her army to attack. Thousands of meat grinders were lined up in a row, and countless pieces of corpses were thrown into the Forgotten City, covering the sky like raindrops. Boom! 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 Countless pieces of corpses fell on the city walls, houses, and roads, and exploded like bombs. Their corrosive blood splashed onto the city walls, causing green smoke to rise. Dang! 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 The Forgotten City's death knell rang out, and it instantly spread to every corner of the city, causing all of the undead's hearts to tighten. War was coming. Adele was riding on a tall war horse of death. She was fully armored, and she was in high spirits. Her long red cloak fluttered in the wind, and her cold eyes were filled with killing intent. She drew her long sword and swung it forwards. Attack! In an instant, millions of undead soldiers surged like a tide across the Ross Basin, directly attacking the Forgotten City. Death Knights covered in heavy armor, undead assassins who were agile and fast, necromancers who controlled countless undead creatures, gargoyles that were as dense as locusts, and frost dragons that continuously roared and gave off a cold aura. Under Adele's command, they launched an all-out attack on the small Forgotten City. Adele was determined to win this battle. They're coming, they're attacking. Stop them. Hurry and stop them. For Lord Lich King kill. The undead soldiers, who had long since been prepared, immediately counterattacked. Taking advantage of the terrain, they quickly pushed back the rebel army's first wave of attacks. However, it was a pity that there were simply too many enemies. There were nearly 6 million undead, which was more than the undead in the entire Forgotten City. Very soon, Adele's undead army broke through the Forgotten City's first line of defense and charged into the city. However, the second line of defense was not so easy to break through. The ghost towers and frost towers, which were set up every 100 steps, suddenly lit up as if they had come alive. Oh no, my body is frozen. My soul. What the hell? It's attacking my soul. Pained cries came from the front lines as the undead who had entered the city were counterattacked by the Forgotten City. The ghost tower and frozen city quickly harvested these undead souls. The meat grinders occupying the high ground of the castle also began to counterattack. The corpses covered in corrosive blood were thrown towards Adele's undead army. Adele's undead army quickly got a taste of what it was like, and was bombarded by the meat grinders until they cried for their parents. Both sides of the battle were undead. Adele's side had troops, and the Forgotten City also had troops. Not long after, a cold aura rose from the direction of the boneyard. The Forgotten City's air force, under the lead of the frost dragons, began to counterattack. As the knell rang, all the residents of the Forgotten City mobilized. Although they were weak, with some only having the strength of a master, they all bravely picked up their weapons and attacked the invaders who had come from afar. They're finally here, Cronia said with a grave expression as she stood in front of the platform of the undead hall in the center of the Forgotten City, looking at the dark clouds rising in front of her. It's time to go on stage. Shea's eyes were filled with fighting spirit. "We must defend the forgotten city. We have no way out." Alice was silent, but the sword in her hand gradually tightened. For the undead, Rose roared in a low voice, and in an instant, she turned into a huge monster. The forgotten city's undead relied on the ghost towers and frost towers to fight back. Adele's army left a ground full of corpses at the second line of defense. To the attacking undead, these ghost towers were like impregnable fortresses. They were also like trenches of death. Once the undead stepped into the attack range of these ghost towers, no matter if they were on the ground or in the air, their lives would be rapidly reaped. Even the most powerful frost dragons fell to the ground under the attacks of these ghost towers. Of course, Adele's 6 million undead army was not to be trifled with. The meat grinder began to attack, and the blood-stained corpses smashed into the ghost towers and exploded. Green flames rose from the exploded ghost towers, and soon they turned into a white light that soared into the sky and disappeared. As the ghost towers were destroyed one after another, the forgotten city's second line of defense was on the verge of collapse. Kill! At this moment, a group of undead charged out of the city. The one leading them was Shea. She charged out like a whirlwind, quickly carving out a path of blood. No one could stop Shea, who was like a death god. She quickly charged into the enemy's camp, and with the cooperation of this new force, the rear of Adele's army suffered. Ka! Ka! A meat grinder fell apart under Shea's sword. A 10 Victory stone statue saw that the situation was bad and turned to flee. However, it was swarmed by the undead like wolves and tigers and turned into scrap metal. Retreat. Hurry and retreat. The undead mages, who had weak bodies and were powerless in close combat, were so shocked that their faces turned pale. An undead army led by a death knight had already killed their way into their camp. In an instant, dozens of undead mages fell into pools of blood. Shea and her undead army were like a sharp knife, ruthlessly stabbing into the hearts of the undead. Adele's undead army's attack was suppressed. Bang! At this moment, Shea's sword seemed to have bumped into an iron wall and was bounced back by a powerful force. She turned her head and saw that it was Adele. "Your time of death has come. Humans." Adele elegantly twirled her sword as she spoke with a relaxed expression. "Is that so?" Shea stared unwaveringly into Adele's eyes. In the face of a powerful god, she did not choose to retreat. "Your strength is pitifully weak. Even if you take over the Forgotten City, you won't be that strong. You're relying on nothing more than Ron, who received the Lich King's inheritance." Adele said with a cold smile. "Then you should put down your weapons and surrender to us. Surrender to the great Lich King. You should know that not only did Ron obtain the Calamity God staff, he also obtained the Lich King's power inheritance." Shea said word by word. With her personality, even if she was about to die in battle, she would not say such words that sounded like she was begging for mercy. It could be seen that the situation in the Forgotten City was extremely tense. "But now, where's Ron?" Adele said with a smile. Shea's expression changed. "I already know that Ron is not in the Forgotten City." Adele laughed. "But human, you're too naive." "That's right. The Lich King Hermes is indeed a great hero. But human, I have to remind you that 100,000 years have already passed." Shea fell silent. "Fame only belongs to the past. Who is the true controller of the Calamity Army now? It's the great Divine Emperor. Whether or not he has the Calamity God staff, he will still be the master of the Calamity Army. So what if Ron is in the city? He can't change anything. Perhaps some of my irrational subordinates have surrendered to you, but they can't change the overall situation." The corners of Adele's mouth curled up slightly. "Don't be so stubborn. Human, I see that you're quite strong. If you're willing to put down your weapons and surrender, I, Adele, swear in the name of the gods that I will guarantee your life. How about it?" Before Shea could reply, a furious roar came from afar. "Shea, don't listen to her nonsense." As she spoke, the Spider Queen Lolth descended from the sky. Her huge body landed on the ground, filling the air with smoke and dust. At this moment, she stood in front of Adele, her entire body emitting a cold, murderous aura. Adele, your opponent is me, Spider Queen Lolth. Adele raised her beautiful eyes. 100,000 years ago, you led the Spider Clan away from the Calamity Army. I didn't expect to see you again 100,000 years later. Unfortunately, you chose the wrong formation. I didn't choose the wrong one, Lolth said coldly. We, the Spider Clan, will only be loyal to the Great Lich King, not to that worthless fistmare. You're courting death. Adele was furious. She abruptly spurred her warhorse and charged towards Lolth. Very good. Lolth grinned and fought with Adele. The two gods once again clashed fiercely. Chapter 901. At this moment, Ron was indeed in trouble. Boom! In his mind, Ron once again repelled the undead dragon's attack, but now he was in a bit of a bad situation. Ron's soul power was getting weaker and weaker, but the terrifying undead dragon was getting stronger and stronger. What was even more terrifying was that his mind was about to collapse. How is this possible? Ron was both shocked and angry. At this moment, the undead dragon once again pounced. Boom! Ron only heard a loud sound in his mind, then felt a headache and fainted after an unknown period of time. Ron slowly opened his eyes. What he saw was a blank space. Where am I? What is this place? Ron rubbed his eyes and looked around. He was actually in the clouds in the sky. Just as Ron was thinking about why he appeared here, the surrounding clouds slowly drifted away, and a magnificent scene came into view. That is, Ron's eyes suddenly opened wide, his face full of disbelief. Forgotten City. At this moment, Forgotten City was already burning with raging flames. The flames soared to the sky, accompanied by earth-shattering screams and shouts of killing. Enemy troops poured in like a tide. Looking from the sky, the whole ground was black. Under the enemy's attack, the whole Forgotten City was about to fall. What was strange was that the attacking enemies were also using the Scourge's banner. What? Could it be that the Scourge of the Ice Crown Castle has already started to attack Forgotten City? Seeing this scene, Ron was shocked. At this time, Ron saw a petite female figure. She was wearing the heavy armor of a Death Knight and holding a long sword. She was forcing Spider Queen Lolth, who was holding a pair of large stingers, to retreat. Who is she? Is she a hero from the Ice Crown Castle? Ron guessed correctly. That person was the Death Knight of the Ice Crown Castle, Adele. At this moment, she was leading the Scourge to attack Forgotten City. Countless undead poured into Forgotten City, fighting with the undead in the city. For a moment, Forgotten City was in imminent danger. This isn't an illusion, right? Ron was both surprised and suspicious. He didn't know if everything in front of him was just an illusion that he had visualized or if it was really happening. However, everything in front of him made him extremely nervous and angry. At this moment, Ron clenched his fists, wishing he could immediately fly back to the Forgotten City and kill all of the invaders. Shea! At this time, Ron exclaimed. He saw Shea, but her situation was not good. At this moment, Shea was surrounded by countless undeads. She was like a lone boat in the sea, ready to capsize at any time. The guards around her fell down one by one, but she still waved her long sword, resisting wave after wave of the enemy's attacks. The difference in numbers was simply too great, and no matter how brave and tenacious the Forgotten City's defenders were, they could not stop the flood of enemies. The Forgotten City's undead fell one after another. Even though he knew it was an illusion, Ron was still so angry that he clenched his fists, and his eyes were about to burst into flames. Damn it! Ron fiercely cursed. At this moment, he wished he could fly down and fight alongside Shea, Rose, and the others. Unfortunately, he was now a soul. What is that? Ron suddenly opened his eyes wide. At this time, he saw a shadow. He didn't know when this shadow had quietly appeared behind Shea. It was an undead assassin. Shea was fighting with the undead, but she didn't sense the danger behind her at all. Shea, "Be careful behind you," Ron shouted in horror. Unfortunately, Shea couldn't hear him at this moment. The shadow had already arrived behind Shea. Ron could even see the sinister smile on the undead assassin's face. In an instant, the undead assassin revealed his figure, like the god of death descending. At the same time, a dagger flashed with cold light and ruthlessly pierced into Shea's back. Bang! A loud sound was heard. Shea's eyes suddenly opened wide, revealing a look of disbelief. "No!" Ron issued a heart-rending scream. It was as if a violent rage gushed out from the bottom of his heart, filling his whole body. He helplessly watched Shea struggle a few times before slowly falling to the ground from the nightmare's back. In an instant, Ron completely erupted. At this moment, his whole body erupted with cyan flames, surging and burning. The awakened power quickly condensed. Boom! The scene before his eyes turned into countless fragments, returning to reality in the blink of an eye. What was reflected in front of Ron's eyes was that terrifying undead dragon, gnashing its teeth as it rushed towards Ron. "Go to hell!" Ron's eyes emitted an ominous glint. He raised his huge fist and fiercely punched at the undead dragon. Night fell. In the Weeping Valley, the wind slowly blew, accompanied by the never-ending cries of the Weeping Valley, as if tens of thousands of undead were wailing. In the gloomy forest, a black figure appeared. It was a huge, bloodthirsty demon wolf. The bloodthirsty demon wolf was one of the mysterious and terrifying beasts of the realm of the gods. It possessed a powerful destructive power, berserk and ferocious. It had followed the strong scent of blood here. This was the territory of the god-tier undead dragon. This made the hungry, bloodthirsty demon wolf somewhat hesitant. It wandered around the periphery for a few days before it finally couldn't hold back its hunger and rushed in. As it saw, in the middle of the valley, corpses were scattered all over the ground. These corpses had already begun to rot, emitting a strong stench. Rotten meat was originally one of the sources of food for the bloodthirsty demon wolf. However, if there is good food, there must be good life to enjoy. The bloodthirsty demon wolf sniffed left and right. Only when it didn't smell the undead dragon's aura did it relax. It cautiously approached step by step. Soon, the bloodthirsty demon wolf came across a corpse. This was an undead who had already died. His eyes were wide open and his mouth was agape. The astonishment on his face was still the same as it was at the moment before his death. There was a horrified expression on his face. A sharp sword was stuck in his chest. The bloodthirsty demon wolf touched the undead's corpse and sniffed it carefully. After confirming that it was indeed dead, it relaxed. It opened its mouth, revealing a row of white teeth, and gnawed at the corpse with all its might. Crunch, crunch. The sound of gnawing on the corpse was particularly loud in the night sky. Soon, the undead's corpse was completely devoured, and even the bones were swallowed. If the ghouls saw this scene, they would definitely feel ashamed of their inferiority. With the bloodthirsty demon wolf's huge body, a single corpse naturally couldn't satisfy its appetite. At this time, its gaze was already fixed on another undead's corpse not far away. At this time, the bloodthirsty demon wolf's pupils shrank. Its gaze was fixed on the figure in the center of the corpses. It was a human. To a strange beast from the realm of the gods, it wasn't afraid of humans. Unlike those corpses that were scattered all over the ground, this human was sitting down. No matter how one looked at it, this scene was particularly strange. Roar! The bloodthirsty demon wolf bared its teeth and growled. Its beast instincts told it that the human in front of it was extremely dangerous. Most importantly, this dangerous existence was still alive. The bloodthirsty demon wolf and the human were in a deadlock for a while before it realized that although the human was alive, he wasn't moving at all. The bloodthirsty demon wolf mustered up its courage and decided to test the waters. It took a bite of the undead's corpse under it. Half of the corpse's face had already fallen into its stomach. There was no reaction. The bloodthirsty demon wolf tried to take another bite. Seeing that the human still didn't react, it was relieved and began to eat the corpse in large mouthfuls. The bloodthirsty demon wolf didn't dare to pounce on the human. It knew that it was no match for this human. Although this human was young, he was a god, a genuine god. The aura of a god couldn't be concealed. Even if he was sitting still, the terrifying aura he emitted still made the bloodthirsty demon wolf tremble. Fortunately, this god didn't care about its affairs. This made the bloodthirsty demon wolf feel relieved. It gnawed on the corpse, raising its head from time to time and staring vigilantly at the sitting human. Unknowingly, a strange aura enveloped the entire valley, and the moon in the sky quietly hid behind the clouds. The birds and insects also stopped chirping, and the sky suddenly darkened. Only the bloodthirsty demon wolf was still unaware. It tore off a large piece of flesh from the undead's corpse and swallowed it down with gurgling sounds. Suddenly, the bloodthirsty demon wolf's movement stopped. Although it didn't know what had happened, its beast instinct still made it feel danger. It raised its head and looked around, looking for the source of the danger. At this moment, a change occurred. The corpse under it suddenly opened its eyes and reached out like lightning, strangling the bloodthirsty demon wolf's throat in an instant. No matter how much the bloodthirsty demon wolf thought about it, it would never have imagined that the danger would come from the corpse that it had just eaten. After being startled, it struggled with all its might, but it didn't expect that the corpse's hand was like an iron clamp, firmly gripping its throat. A powerful aura of death instantly descended like a god. Woo! 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 The bloodthirsty demon wolf opened its mouth wide in horror, spitting out its scarlet tongue. It kept struggling, and its huge body kept twisting, but it couldn't break free from the corpse's hand. Finally, it stretched out its legs and stopped moving. The moon quietly came out of the clouds again, and the moonlight once again covered the earth, as if it didn't see the strange scene just now. Everything returned to silence. At this time, the human sitting in the middle of the corpse moved. He suddenly opened his eyes, and his eyes turned dark green. Ka! 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 Chapter 902. In the Forgotten City, raging flames pierced through the sky. The undead inside were in complete chaos, and there were flames and massacres everywhere. It was like hell. The last line of defense had been broken through, and the undead city's defenders had been slaughtered by the Calamity Army. Hold on, hold on, White loudly shouted. At this moment, he was bathed in blood and looked like a man made of blood. It was unknown how many battles he had gone through to become like this, facing more and more enemies. Sweat mixed with blood flowed down White's forehead. He was not afraid, but in despair. After all, behind him was Ron's dark altar. Once the dark altar was broken through, everything would be over. Not only White, but all of the undead in the Forgotten City were covered with a shadow of despair. They were going to lose. Boom! A ball of cyan flames hit a corner of the dark altar, and then it burned fiercely, turning the entire dark altar into a sea of fire. Not good, White shouted. He did not care about the injuries on his body and madly rushed towards the ball of flames. Bang! A black arrow came out of nowhere and hit him squarely in the chest. The powerful force attached to the arrow caused White's body to fall heavily onto the dark altar, and his blood dyed the ground red. Whoa! White spat out a mouthful of blood and used all his strength to crawl forward. He trembled as he stretched out his right hand towards the ball of soul fire on the dark altar. That was Ron's soul fire. At this moment, that ball of cyan flames was gradually approaching, and Ron's blue soul fire was like a candle in the wind, tottering and about to be extinguished at any moment. White fiercely gritted his teeth, and with his last breath, he wanted to pull out that ball of cyan flames. Unfortunately, he could only stretch out half of his hand before it powerlessly drooped down. His eyes gradually dimmed, and the blue soul fire became weaker and weaker. At this moment, White's eyes lit up. He smiled, and there was a trace of joy and excitement in his eyes. As he lay dying, he seemed to see the blue soul fire suddenly burning fiercely, forcing back that ball of cyan flames in an instant. You have no hope. Surrender. and perhaps I can give you a decent death," Adele said proudly as blood dripped down from the tip of her sword. Spider Queen Lolth was panting heavily. Her chest had been slashed open by the long sword. It was so deep that her bones could be seen. At this moment, her back was leaning against a broken wall, and her exhausted body could not muster any strength. Hee, don't even think about it. Rose opened her mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. She sneered, her eyes filled with an unyielding gaze. "You're still so stubborn. Hee, are you still counting on that human called Ron?" Adele had already anticipated this outcome. She smiled coldly and strode towards Rose with her sword in hand. A bitter smile appeared on Rose's face. She slowly closed her eyes and silently waited for death to descend upon her. "Let's go," Emily said. John was stunned. "Why? These undead are finished." Emily pointed at the forgotten city. "There's no point in staying here any longer." "Weren't you very interested in that human Lich King?" John shrugged. "He's not in the city at all," Emily said with certainty. "As for where he is, I don't know. However, with the current situation, even if he comes back, it won't be of much use. That's too regretful." John sighed. He looked at the forgotten city with a complicated gaze. "I didn't think that after fighting to the death with the orcs, the undead of the Ice Crown Castle would take advantage of us in the end. They controlled the timing of their attack very well. Now that I think about it, we really underestimated that guy called Fismai," Emily said. She looked at the forgotten city with a regretful gaze. However, she quickly withdrew her gaze and turned to leave. At this moment, Emily suddenly stopped in her tracks and turned around. Her beautiful eyes opened wide, and her face revealed an expression of extreme shock. Impossible. What? John's face was filled with shock. However, in the next moment, his face was filled with shock. What's going on? The azure sky had unknowingly changed color. It was as if night had descended. Clouds surged, lightning flashed, and thunder roared. A chilling aura of death came from the distant sky, stepping on clouds. The abnormality in the sky attracted everyone's attention. Adele raised her head to look at the sky, a trace of shock in her eyes. "It's Ron. Ron's back." Rose's face was filled with excitement. She could feel Ron's vast and pure divine aura. Countless layers of clouds gathered in the sky, forming a gigantic skull with its mouth wide open, roaring incessantly. A figure dressed in black suddenly appeared in the sky. He held a white bone staff with many skulls hanging from it. His cold eyes swept across the land below, as if he was a former king, inspecting his territory. "Hermes, it's him. He's back." At this moment, Emily's face became deathly pale. She finally remembered the mighty name that caused the entire mortal plane to tremble. "No, he's not Hermes. He's a human, that human called Ron." John's eyes were fixed on Ron in the sky, his heart filled with shock. He discovered that the human called Ron was even more powerful than before. If it was a few days ago, John would have had the confidence to fight Ron. However, the strength that Ron had displayed now was enough to make John shrink back. A vast aura of death shook the sky. The air was filled with the smell of decay. The giant skull continued to roar, as if the god of death had descended. "No, he's not Ron. He's the Lich King." Emily looked at the sky with a complicated expression. "He's back. The Lich King." The Lich King. The entire forgotten city was in an uproar. All the undead loudly chanted the name of the Lich King. To them, Ron's return had brought back their dusty memories. That was when the undead were at their strongest. Their former glory and lost dignity had all dissipated with the wind because of this mighty name. Now, he had finally returned. Even the undead of Adele's army were no exception. Some of the undead stopped attacking and stood blankly, not knowing what to do. Others knelt on the ground, trembling. Ron's figure slowly descended to the ground. He stood in front of Adele, his expression unchanged. Rose struggled to prop herself up and smiled. "Cough, cough. Ron. Huh, you seem to have come a bit late." rose slowly, straightened her body, a flower-like smile appearing on her face. If you wanted to see me battered and exhausted, you've already gotten your wish. Adele narrowed her eyes, quietly sizing up the legendary human in front of her. A black skeletal robe wrapped around his not very tall body. His pitch-black pupils were like the unfathomable sea. His silent expression was solemn and serene, so calm that not a single ripple could be seen. Most importantly, he held the symbol of the highest authority of the Scourge in his hands, the Scourge Staff. Whoever held the Scourge Staff would be the new Lich King. But at this moment, the symbol of the highest authority of the Scourge was held in the hands of a human. Adele had a certain impulse. She wanted to kill Ron and firmly hold the symbol of the Scourge in her hands. "I don't care who you are, human," Adele laughed coldly, waving the long sword in her hand. "If you don't hand over the Scourge Staff in your hands, death will be your best outcome." A slight cold wind blew, causing everyone present to shiver involuntarily. Adele's callous words, her ice-cold long sword, and the undead of her subordinates who continuously surrounded them, their eyes filled with murderous intent, intertwined to form a strange scene. Perplexed sinners will eventually be redeemed. Only those who are stubborn will choose to persist in going about things the wrong way. Ron smiled faintly, suddenly saying something without rhyme or reason. At this moment, he took a deep breath and said coldly, "Looks like you still don't know who is standing in front of you. Ha! That's fine too. Then I'll let you wake up properly." Chapter 903. Boom! With a loud sound, the ground behind Ron caved in without any warning. Then, a powerful aura of death surged out from the hole behind him. Boom! Rumble! Rumble, the ground shook. In an instant, a huge skeletal arm stretched out from the hole and slammed into the ground. Then it suddenly propped itself up, revealing a huge, sinister skeleton head and a decaying body covered in heavy armor. This terrifying skeleton was dozens of feet tall, and its body was burning with dark green flames. It held a long-handled axe in its hand, and it constantly let out angry roars. A powerful divine aura shook the surroundings, as if even the world had lost its luster. What? What is that? Heavens, that's a skeleton. What a huge skeleton. The undead on the battlefield were scared silly. Their bodies trembled as they looked at the terrifying monster in front of them with deathly pale faces. In front of the powerful divine aura, it was as if they had lost their fighting strength in an instant. That skeleton giant. Emily's entire body trembled as a feeling of palpitations instantly occupied her heart. In that instant, her dusty memories were unlocked, as if she had returned to the ancient battlefield from 100,000 years ago. The skeleton giant was the most powerful undead creature that the undead could summon. Its strength far surpassed that of the frost dragon and the skeleton sovereign. It was comparable to a powerful god. No, to be more precise, it was a god. In the ancient battlefield from 100,000 years ago, the skeleton giant was the most terrifying nightmare in the hearts of all the warriors of the Righteous Alliance. Its huge body could cross any city wall, its heavy axe could sweep away all enemies, and its terrifying divine aura of death could contend against any god. But the most frightening thing was that this terrifying skeleton giant was the most powerful undead that only the Lich King could summon. Its appearance often meant the arrival of the Lich King, Hermes. God, this guy actually summoned a god. At this moment, Hardadef's face was pale, and his fingers were clenched tightly, making a caw-caw sound. Although the skeleton giant was strong, and Hardadef believed that he could still put up a fight, what if Ron joined in? Hardadef's heart sank. At that moment, he finally understood that Ron's strength had far surpassed his. Thinking back to the battle from before, Ron's strength had improved so quickly that even he, a genius of the Angel clan, was deeply shocked. Is this guy really human? Hardadef took a deep breath. As far as he knew, the talents of low-level creatures like humans were not enough to cultivate their strength to such a level. Adele was equally shocked. At this moment, She was standing in front of this terrifying skeletal giant. The divine power of death that was as vast as the mountains and seas almost suffocated her. This is a god. Adele felt that her voice was trembling. The pressure brought about by the skeletal giant was not something that undead creatures like the Frost WYRM could compare to. Ron's side is definitely going to win. Emily looked at Ron's figure in the sky with a grave expression. Even a god can't easily defeat this skeletal giant. As soon as Emily's voice fell, the huge skeletal giant had already begun to move. It growled, and a giant axe in its hand blew up a gust of wind. Boom! A mournful cry came from the sky. A Frost WYRM in Adele's army was cut open from its chest to its abdomen. Then its head tilted, and its huge body fell rapidly. Not good, Ron. It's falling. The soldiers of Adele's army looked at the huge shadow falling from the sky, and their eyes were filled with horror. They quickly ran back, afraid that they would be affected. Unfortunately, by the time they reacted, it was already too late. At this moment, countless undead soldiers were covered by the falling shadow of the Frost WYRM. Boom! Countless white ice dust flew in the air, and the undead soldiers who could not dodge in time were crushed into meat paste amidst their wails. One strike, just one strike. A Frost WYRM with god-level strength was instantly killed. How is this possible? That was a Frost WYRM. Everyone was stunned. Shock and fear occupied their bodies and minds, and their fighting spirit collapsed in an instant. The strength of the skeletal war god had far exceeded the scope of their understanding. Facing this terrifying skeletal giant, a feeling of invincibility arose in everyone's hearts. The skeletal giant took large strides forward, and Adele's army scattered in all directions. Some brave ones tried to fight back, but unfortunately, it was all in vain. At this moment, the skeletal giant was like an indestructible chariot, destroying all obstacles in front of it one by one. Whether it was the Frost WRM or the skeleton sovereign in front of the gods summoned by Ron, they could only be crushed. At this moment, the skeletal giant's giant axe came crashing down on Adele. Not good, Lady Adele. The shouts of her subordinates sounded in her ears, and a green light flashed in front of Adele's eyes. Boom! The earth shook and the mountains swayed. Where the giant axe fell, the earth cracked like a spider web, and the powerful force blew up a gale, sending sand and stones flying. Clang! Clang! The storm dispersed, and a large hole appeared where the giant axe fell, but Adele was nowhere to be seen. Where's the commander? The undead looked around, looking for Adele's trace. Over there, a sharp-eyed undead saw Adele and shouted loudly. They saw Adele riding the death chariot, running along the long handle of the giant axe at lightning speed. Like an arrow, she quickly leaped above the skeletal giant's head. Adele shouted. Her delicate body shook, and she suddenly jumped up, leaving the death chariot. She raised her knights, soared high, and with the sound of wind and thunder, she slammed it towards the skeletal giant. Boom! A thunderous sound. The skeletal giant staggered, but quickly stood up again. A large hole had been broken in the right side of its head and neck by a huge force. Its shoulder blade was shattered, and the arm holding the giant axe was almost cut off. Long live! The undead from Iceground Castle cheered, as if they saw the dawn of victory. No, no! How can this be? At this moment, the commander of the army, Adele, suddenly opened her eyes wide, her face full of shock. She could clearly see that the terrifying wounds on the giant skeleton's body were rapidly healing. The rotten flesh and broken bones were soon as good as new. It's useless. At this moment, Ron's faint voice sounded in Adele's ears. He was calm and unruffled, with his hands behind his back, calmly looking at the continuously roaring skeletal giant, as if admiring a perfect piece of art. It's the strongest undead creature that the undead can summon. It's the Lich King's most loyal servant. At this moment, Ron slowly lowered his head, calmly looking at Adele. and only the true Lich King can control it. Its name is Undying War God. Undying War God? Chapter 904. Retreat. Retreat. At this moment, Adele no longer hesitated. She commanded the undead soldiers on her side to retreat. Soon, the Calamity army that had besieged the Forgotten City had completely retreated, leaving behind a ground full of mutilated corpses. We've won. Long live the Lich King. At this moment, the entire Forgotten City was in an uproar. Countless undead flooded the streets, walked out of the trenches, waved the hats in their hands, and waved the banners in their hands. It was a bustling sea. The situation had been reversed so quickly that even Hardadef did not expect it. He turned his head and saw Emily clenching her teeth, her face pale. He was shocked. "Lady Emily, what's wrong?" Hardadef rushed forward and reached out to support the tottering Emily. "We've been discovered by Ron." Emily laughed bitterly. "He just greeted me." It could be considered a warning, what? Hardadef could not help but be shocked when he heard this. How is that possible from so far away? He warned us not to interfere with the affairs of the undead. Emily's expression was extremely unsightly. In that instant of conflict, she had suffered a bit and clearly felt Ron's terrifying strength. This kind of strength had far exceeded Emily's imagination. "Let's go." Lady Emily. Hardadef supported Emily and immediately made a decision. He looked at the Forgotten City, his eyes filled with unwillingness. Emily did not object and nodded. Not long after, the two of them turned into a ball of white light and disappeared on the spot. Ron. At this moment, Cronia came up to him. At this moment, she was covered in wounds and looked exhausted, but the joy on her face could not be concealed. "Lord Lich King, you've finally returned." In that instant, she remembered Ron's identity. Cronia's expression became somewhat reserved, and she bowed. Ron smiled and waved his hand. "Just call me Ron from now on. You've finally returned." Rose smiled sweetly when she saw Ron. Her pale face was devoid of any color. "If you were any later, you would have had to help me clean up the corpse." After the war ended, the entire Forgotten City was in a mess. Broken corpses were everywhere, and buildings were burning with black smoke. From time to time, almost inaudible moans could be heard from the crowd. Only the broken blood-red skull flag was still stubbornly fluttering in the wind, as if it symbolized the undead's unyielding will. The Forgotten City's undead started to clean up the battlefield, moving corpses and collecting weapons. Because they were used to seeing death, most of their faces were numb. To these undead who had obtained true faith, death was the final destination of all creatures, and there was nothing to fear. This was war. "Where's Shea?" Ron looked around, but did not see Shea's figure. "Ron, I'm here." Just as Ron was searching for Shea, he discovered Shea's figure walking out from the other side of the collapsed city wall. Although her face was filled with fatigue, it was filled with excitement. Behind her was a group of undead. However, when Cronia saw the insignia on the undead's body, her expression changed greatly. "Careful." Cronia pulled out her sword with a swish. "They're the undead from the Iceground Castle, what?" The surrounding undead were shocked, and the atmosphere suddenly became tense. They all took out their weapons and rushed forward. "Protect Lord Lich King. Kill them." The undead from the Iceground Castle also looked nervous and raised their weapons. "Wait, listen to me first." Facing these furious undead, Shea was somewhat anxious. She waved her hands with all her might, stopping the surging crowd. Unfortunately, her efforts were in vain, and a great battle was about to break out. "Wait." At this time, Ron spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was no less than thunder in the ears of the undead. The restless crowd instantly quieted down. When they saw Ron, their eyes were filled with reverence. Shea finally breathed a sigh of relief, but then she heard Ron ask, "Shea, what's going on with these people?" "Ron, they've already surrendered." Shea replied. She had been seriously injured in the battle with Adele. When those undead surrounded her, she had no strength left and was quickly captured alive. Those undead had wanted to capture her and take her back to Adele to claim credit, but Ron had suddenly appeared like a god and defeated Adele's army. After seeing the Calamity God's staff and the terrifying skeleton giant, these undead immediately changed their minds. They did not retreat with Adele's army, but stayed. They healed Shea's injuries and gathered a portion of the undead, planning to surrender to the Forgotten City. Surrender? A trace of astonishment flashed in Ron's eyes. At this time, a thunderous voice sounded out. "Put down your weapons. This person in front of you is the great Lich King." Walala, when the undead from the Iceground Castle heard this, they all threw down their weapons. A tall Death Knight walked out from the crowd, looking like their commander. He took large strides towards Ron and knelt on one knee. He lowered his head and raised the sword in his hand, an incomparably respectful expression on his face. "Respected Lich King, I am the leader of the 19th Army of Death Knights under the Calamity God Emperor Fismai, Aloysius. On behalf of the 19th Army of Death Knights, I announce that we have broken away from the illegal regime of Fismai and have pledged our loyalty to the Lich King, the great undead lord." The atmosphere was extremely tense, and the surroundings were so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. All of the undead held their breaths as they looked at Ron, waiting for his orders. Ron deeply breathed in. To him, the undead from the Iceground Castle were his subjects and not his enemies. Meeting them on the battlefield was a sad thing. This was a civil war between the undead. It was illegal, and this war had to end as soon as possible. Ron could not help but clench his fists, secretly making up his mind. Death Knight Aloysius was still kneeling on the ground, his heart uneasy. At this moment, Ron stepped forward and stretched out his hand to take the sword in Aloysius' hands. Chapter 905. Adele's Undead Army Camp. Adele led the army in a retreat until they left the Hermetic Plains and retreated to Red Sand City. Only then did they stop and slowly gather the army. Although they had suffered an unprecedented defeat at the Iceground Castle, their overall strength hadn't suffered much. On a plain near the Red Sand River, countless tents and defensive facilities had been erected overnight. Adele's undead army was stationed here. At night, a red moon hung in the sky. A light breeze blew, and from time to time, the low groans of the injured undead soldiers could be heard. Red Sand City, Marshal Adele's room. After weighing the strength of both sides, the ambitious Adele was prepared to launch a second battle against the Forgotten City. She had also made a plan to counter the god-level skeleton giant. She was very confident that unless something unexpected happened, the Forgotten City's defeat was inevitable. The difference in strength between the two sides wasn't something that Ron could make up for, even if he really was the successor of the Lich King. However, what worried Adele was whether the low morale of her undead army would be able to take on this kind of battle. "Report. Come," and the voice of an undead soldier came from outside the tent. "I have important news to report to you, Madam Marshal Adele." It was Adele's guard. He stepped in, his voice somewhat anxious. "What is it?" Adele replied without raising her head. Her gaze was fixed on the sheepskin scroll on the table, not moving for a long time. The sheepskin scroll was marked with all kinds of symbols and arrows, and a huge skull in the middle was particularly eye-catching. "What did you say?" "The 55th Army's most elite undead mage army actually ran away?" Hearing this news, Adele was finally shocked. She raised her head from the table, her face pale and her voice trembling. It could be felt that she was extremely angry at this moment. Yes, in the evening, their army commander, Cotter, falsely claimed that he had received Madame Marshal's orders to go out of the city to carry out mission. However, he didn't have any proof, which aroused the suspicions of the defenders. The two sides broke out into a conflict. Afterwards, although our reinforcements arrived, they were still able to break out of the encirclement. We only caught a few unlucky bastards," the guard trembled as he replied. "What's going on? Why did they run away? Could it be that they—" Adele's heart sank. She stood up in a daze. The undead mage army of the 55th Army was the best of the best. It wasn't strange that they could break out of the encirclement. But what Adele didn't understand was why they did this. Were they not afraid of being punished by military law? According to the people we caught, the reason they left the army was to go to the Forgotten City, to follow the real Lich King. The soldier stuttered. What? Adele's body swayed a few times before she sat down heavily on the chair. Her face was pale. The thing she had been most worried about had finally happened. There was no doubt as to who the real Lich King was. The appearance of the Calamity Divine Staff and the Skeleton Giant proved Ron's identity as the successor. But to Adele, the Lich King from 100,000 years ago didn't have much of a relationship with the current Calamity Army. Even if he was, so what? But in the hearts of some undead, it was different. 100,000 years didn't cause the light of the Lich King Hermes to dim. On the contrary, due to the current situation, the undead missed this great leader of the undead even more. Adele stood up and paced back and forth in the room. Her expression was extremely anxious. The soldier hesitated for a moment. Lord Marshal, ever since the Battle of the Forgotten City, the morale of the army has been unstable. The 55th Undead Mage Army is only one of the reasons. I know that you want to start a second Battle of the Forgotten City, but with the current situation, even if they really go to the battlefield, they may not be willing to give their lives. If things go wrong, I know. Adele waved her hand and said in a deep voice, the current situation is the most troublesome, but the only thing we can do now is to rely on the law enforcement team. That's right. Where's Lady Scarlet? Scarlet was the army supervisor, and in this situation, she was duty-bound. Lady Scarlet went back to the ice-crowned castle the day before the Battle of Talus. Didn't she tell you? What? Adele was a little surprised, but she hadn't seen her in the past few days. Scarlet was also a troublesome person in the army, so Adele hadn't paid much attention to this matter. It's fine if she went back. Let's do our own things. Adele waved her hand and said, increase the patrols in the various camps, and report to me immediately if you discover anything. Yes, Lord Marshal. The soldier saluted and replied. That's right. What should we do with the guys we caught? Do you even need to ask? Of course, we'll kill them all. Adele shouted in annoyance. Yes, Lord Marshal. The guard replied in a low voice and quietly retreated. Wait. At this time, Adele called out to the soldier. She muttered to herself for a moment and sighed. Let's lock them up first. Ice-crowned Castle, Imperial Palace, Divine King Phizmai's bedroom. Your Majesty, you were really amazing just now. On the bed, Scarlet was lying in Phizmai's arms as she spoke coquettishly. Isn't it all because of you, this charming little fairy? Phizmai stroked Scarlet's smooth back and said with a smile, look at your skin. Even the highest elves can't compare to it. That's right, the war isn't over yet. Why did you come back? Phizmai asked. Isn't it because of that despicable Adele? She disobeyed your orders and drove me back. Scarlet raised an eyebrow when she heard this. She had finally found a chance to complain. She only has herself in her heart, never your Majesty. Your Majesty, you must teach her a lesson. Otherwise, she won't listen to you in the future, Scarlet said without stopping. I see. Phizmai muttered to himself. It wasn't that he didn't know how important Adele was to him, but he was more worried about the loss of imperial power. Compared to Tito, Adele lacked loyalty to him. Indeed, I must teach this fellow a lesson. Phizmai nodded. Then what do you plan to do? Scarlet finally smiled when Phizmai agreed. Your Majesty, you don't have to worry about this. Scarlet will definitely do it beautifully for you, all right. Phizmai was a little tired. He closed his eyes and muttered, I'll leave it to you, but be careful. The war at the front lines isn't over yet. I know. A cold smile appeared on Scarlet's face. She watched as Phizmai fell into a deep sleep, then quietly got dressed and got up. No one knew how terrifying a woman's jealousy and vengeance could be. Perhaps Phizmai knew, but he had underestimated Scarlet. That night, no one knew what had happened. They only knew that an army had left the palace and secretly surrounded the residence of the former military chief, Tito, who had lost his power and authority. As dawn approached, A huge black crow soared into the sky from the balcony of Fismy Palace. It let out a shrill cry as it flapped its wings and left the palace. Under its sharp claws was a small wooden box tightly tied to it. Adele, I've said it before. I'll definitely make you regret it. Definitely, huh? On the huge balcony, Scarlet, who was wearing a black necromancer's robe, laughed loudly. There was a hint of malevolence in her laughter. I hope you like the present I've given you. Adele's trusted guard didn't know what had happened either. He only knew that after receiving the package from the Iceground Castle, Adele had screamed and fainted, then fell ill. She couldn't even carry out her daily military duties, so all the important military matters fell to this guard. Chapter 906. The Iceground Castle was as peaceful as usual. All the undead went to work at sunrise and went to rest at sunset, as if the war on the front lines didn't affect their lives. Occasionally, people would talk about Adele, who had gone to war on Tito's behalf, with blank expressions on their faces. Suddenly, one day, an explosive piece of news came from the front lines, completely shocking the entire Iceground Castle. Good news. Extremely good news. The Expeditionary Army has achieved a decisive victory. The Scourge Army, led by Adele, has defeated the rebel army, conquered the Forgotten City, recovered the Hakant district, and even killed the human who called himself the Lich King. A warhorse of death galloped on the heavy bluestone paved road. The knight on the horse shouted excitedly as he threw flyers with the news of Adele's army's victory into the air, scattering them on both sides of the road. What? We actually won? And recovered the Hakant district that we've lost for many years? The morning sun shone on the ground. The residents of the Iceground Castle who had just woken up picked up the flyers on the road, as if they were still in a dream. In their impression, the Scourge army was extremely weak, not to mention facing the fierce foreign army. Even facing the Plague Army, which was also made up of undead, they were more likely to lose than win. As for the Hakant district and the Forgotten City, it had been the territory of the Scourge army 100,000 years ago. Ever since it was invaded by the orcs, many people had forgotten this fact. Is this true? That's great. An old undead man held the flyer, so excited that tears flowed down his face. The flyer said that the Forgotten City had been recovered from the rebel army, but the ordinary residents didn't care about this. What they cared about was that the Hakant district, which had been lost for 100,000 years, had actually returned to the hands of the undead. This was a huge matter, symbolizing that the Scourge army had taken an important step forward in their revival. Not long after this shocking piece of good news, another piece of news came from the palace. In order to commend Adele for leading the Calamity Army to eliminate the rebel army, the Calamity Emperor Fismer decided to confer upon Adele the title of Viscount and personally confer upon her the honor. Furthermore, on the day of Adele's triumphant return, he would hold a grand entrance ceremony in the city. This news caused the Iceground Castle, which had already been boiling, to burn up once again. Adele's name was circulating everywhere on the streets and alleys, becoming the topic of conversation for all the undead residents. Adele, a commoner student from an ordinary military academy, relied on this huge victory that could be recorded in history to become a hot aristocrat. She had also become a hero in the hearts of all the undead. Her reputation had long since overshadowed her mentor, Tito. The news spread like the wind throughout the territory of the Scourge. All the cities under the control of the divine Emperor Fismer were chanting the name of this hero, Adele, the greatest Death Knight. The Plague Legion in the southwest was no exception. They immediately received the news through the spies in the Iceground Castle. What? The human called Ron was actually defeated? So fast. In Plague City, Serumen's study, the commander of the Plague Legion had a look of disappointment as he looked at the leaflet in his hand. This guy seems to be a god, and he had the loyalty of the Crypt Spider Army in Lolth. How could he be defeated so quickly? Serumen's brows furrowed tightly. He had originally thought that this human who called himself the Lich King would be able to give the Scourge a headache for a while. He hadn't thought that he would be defeated so quickly. Is this guy really the Lich King? Saruman shook his head helplessly and threw the leaflet to one side. If this was the Lich King, then the Lich King was too unbearable. Beside him, Gibbon picked up the leaflet and looked at it. His expression became serious. Father, he's just a human. Perhaps he accidentally obtained the Scourge Staff, but that doesn't mean anything. However, we're in danger now. After unifying the Scourge and Hakant, our next target will definitely be us. That's right. I'm very pleased that you think this way. Saruman patted Gibbon's shoulder, his expression becoming gloomy. Adele defeated Ron, and it's very likely that she also obtained the Scourge Staff. She will definitely give the Scourge Staff to Fismai. With the Scourge Staff, Fismai will be able to better control the undead. Perhaps our generals will also. Saruman smiled and didn't continue speaking. However, his smile was somewhat bitter. From the looks of the current situation, no matter how unbearable Fismai is, once he obtains the Scourge Staff, he will be the new Lich King. Unifying the undead main plane is only a matter of time. Gibbon hesitated and stammered. Actually, Father, have you ever thought about, are you talking about surrendering? Saruman glanced at his son. His expression wasn't surprised at all. Saruman smiled. Gibbon, although you are my son, do you know why I left with my generals 100,000 years ago to split the Scourge Army and form the Plague Army? Gibbon looked at his father and shook his head blankly. Saruman sighed silently. Actually, you don't know. 100,000 years ago, Lord Fismai was one of the people I respected the most besides the Great Lich King. Ever since the Great Lich King died in battle, regardless of whether he had the Scourge Staff or not, I fully supported him to become the new Lich King. When Gibbon heard this, he couldn't help but open his mouth wide. It was as if he had heard a fantasy story. But why? But it happened here. Saruman sighed again. At this time, he slowly clenched his fist, and a ferocious look appeared on his face. It was that night, when I passed by his study, guess what I saw? Father, what did you see? Gibbon asked nervously. I saw Uriel. Saruman's face was ashen. It was just a projection of his avatar. What? Uriel? The Archangel Uriel of the Legion of Holy Angels? Gibbon was shocked. In the main plane, Uriel, the Archangel of the Holy Angel Army, was just as famous as Michael. How could Gibbon not know of him? The projection of the Archangel Uriel of the Legion of Holy Angels appearing in Fismai's study was too unbelievable. After all, the Scourge Army and the Legion of Holy Angels were enemies. Father, is there some misunderstanding? Gibbon swallowed a mouthful of saliva and asked, Haha, misunderstanding? Saruman laughed coldly. I hid myself and heard every word of their conversation. I even saw Fismai kneel to Uriel, representing the Scourge Army, to pledge their loyalty to the Legion of Holy Angels. If this is all a misunderstanding, then I really hope it is, then you? Gibbon asked. I was furious on the spot. You should know that at that time, I had just returned from the battlefield with the Legion of Holy Angels. I was quite angry. I destroyed Uriel's avatar with one punch, then loudly reprimanded Fismai for betraying the Scourge Army and the Lich King. I think you know what happened after that. Saruman glanced at Gibbon, a cold light flashing in his eyes. So that's what happened. Gibbon fell silent. But Father, if we can't surrender, then we have to prepare for the upcoming situation. Of course I know that. I've already contacted the Burning Legion of Hell. Saruman smiled, revealing 4 rows of sharp fangs. Don't forget, your father is half demon. The next day, the entire Icecrown Castle was decorated with lanterns and banners for one thing, to welcome the triumphant return of their hero, Commander Adele. Dong! 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 The death knell tolled 13 times, and the tightly shut gates of the heavily guarded Icecrown Castle opened with a creaking sound. With the turning of the mechanism, the heavy drawbridge slammed into the moat on the opposite side. Not long after, a group of fully armed undead soldiers appeared by the moat. The person in the lead was Adele. She stood expressionlessly in the middle of the moat, her head slightly raised as she looked at the heavily guarded fortress. A necromancer stood beside Adele. His entire body was wrapped in a black robe, and his hood covered his face. No one could see his face clearly. He bowed slightly and spoke in a hoarse voice. "Lady Adele, we should enter the castle." Adele nodded and didn't say anything. She walked into Iceground Castle with her head held high. "Adele! Adele!" As soon as Adele and her soldiers walked through the city gates, they were greeted with the cheers of the residents. Countless petals floated down from the sky, covering the main road in red. This was the highest form of welcome for the undead. After failing again and again, the undead of the Calamity Legion desperately needed a victory. They poured all their enthusiasm on Adele, the hero who had returned triumphantly. On the main road of the Long Street, a group of fully armed Death Knights came head-on. The soldiers behind Adele became inexplicably nervous. Some of them pressed their hands on the hilt of their swords, and a dangerous aura spread in the air. However, these knights didn't have any hostility. They walked in front of Adele and dismounted, respectfully bowing. "Your Highness Adele, His Majesty the Emperor ordered me to bring you into the palace. Thank you for your trouble." Adele nodded expressionlessly as a greeting. She recognized this person as the captain of the guards by His Majesty the Emperor's side. But the captain of the guards looked at the soldiers behind Adele with some difficulty. Adele frowned. "They're the generals under my command. In this campaign against the rebel army, they have made great contributions. I was just about to bring them to see His Majesty the Emperor. The captain of the guards hesitated. He sized up the faces of the soldiers and then looked at Adele's serious expression. He finally gave in. "All right, I will personally report to His Majesty. Your Highness Adele, please follow me." Chapter 907. Unlike the bustling situation outside, the golden walls of the palace seemed especially cold and cheerless. Fully armed guards stood in 2 rows, their expressions stern. "Salute!" Swish, swish, swish. Following the command of the guard captain, the soldiers of the Calamity Army on both sides raised their weapons in unison. They tilted their heads slightly, gazing at Adele and the rest who were walking towards them with deep respect in their eyes. Adele, a top student of the Calamity Royal Military Academy, a rising star in the military world, a powerful hero who had returned triumphantly with unparalleled glory. All of this had planted the seeds of loyalty in the hearts of all the soldiers. They looked at their leader with reverence. Perhaps one day, they would have the opportunity to serve under their leader and obtain their own glory in the war. Adele nodded slightly and walked past them expressionlessly under everyone's gazes. After passing through the red-carpeted corridor, Adele came to the front of a huge palace. She stood still slightly, raised her head, and squinted her eyes, carefully looking at the tallest building in the Ice-Crown Castle. In her memory, she had only been to this place twice. The first time was when she had just left for war, and the second time was now. Although Adele was already the commander of the Calamity Army, this place still felt very distant to her. "Your Highness, we have arrived." The guard captain made a humble gesture. He had a smile on his face, but his tone was unquestionable. "I don't think we should keep His Majesty waiting for too long. What do you think? Let's go." Adele was surprisingly not angry. She nodded lightly and took the lead to walk in. The guard captain could only quickly follow. It was a heavily guarded hall. Guards armed to the teeth stood on both sides. They held weapons and stood majestically on both sides. Their faces were covered with cold steel masks, making it impossible to see their faces clearly. An old man in a purple robe sat on a high throne along a giant stone staircase that was more than 10 steps tall. He held a long scepter in his hand and wore a pure gold crown on his head. His dignified gaze swept over the people below. He was the actual controller of the Calamity Army, the Calamity Emperor Fismare. "Your Majesty!" Adele and the rest knelt on one knee and saluted the Calamity Emperor. "Rise!" A smile finally appeared on Fismer's face as he gestured for Adele and the others to stand up. "Adele, my child, You've done well. The first time you led an army, you defeated the human who called himself the Lich King and brought Hakant, which had been lost for 100,000 years, back into the arms of the undead. To be honest, I'm very satisfied with this result. Fismai patted the armrest of the throne lightly and said with a smile, "Your achievements are enough to go down in history, and you will become a new hero. Your name will spread throughout the entire Icecrown Castle, and the entire Scourge army will be glorified because of your victory." Fismai smiled. "And I will personally award you and give you everything you deserve. Your Majesty is too kind." Adele lowered her head and replied indifferently. She paused for a moment. "During the Battle of the Forgotten City, I inadvertently obtained something and wanted to present it to your Majesty." Fismai's eyes lit up. "The Calamity Staff?" Adele nodded. Fismai was overjoyed when he heard this. "Bring it up immediately." Adele glanced at the necromancer beside her and nodded slightly. The necromancer understood, and with a flash of his hand, a black box appeared as if he was performing a magic trick. Adele took the black box and walked up the stairs step by step towards the God King. Hurry up!" Fismai was impatient. The Calamity Staff was a divine weapon that all undead wanted to possess. It represented the highest authority, and with it, Fismai would be the rightful lord of the undead. He had waited for this day for far too long. Just as Adele was 3 steps away from God Emperor Fismare, a sudden change occurred. Swish! What came out of the black box wasn't the Calamity Divine Staff, but a sharp long sword emitting a cold glint. At this time, Adele suddenly raised her head. Her blood-red eyes were filled with murderous intent. Adele rushed up the throne in 3 steps, and amidst the cries of everyone in the hall, the sharp long sword pierced deeply into Fismai's abdomen. Everyone was stunned. No one had thought that Adele would suddenly make a move to assassinate the Divine King. Because the distance was too close and he was caught off guard, the Divine King Fismai was unable to dodge this fatal strike. Fismai's expression was full of shock, but there was not much panic on his face. He was the God King, one of the most powerful gods. He would not be killed so easily. But in the next moment, his eyes suddenly opened wide. The necromancer, standing beside Adele, slowly took off his hood, revealing a human face. The suppressed power was released without restraint. Only then did the God King realize that this person was actually a god, and his power was suppressed by this god who was even more powerful than him. He could not use any strength at all. Human, god, who else could have these 2 identities? In the entire mortal plane, there was only Ron. At this moment, Fismai finally understood. But what he did not understand was why Adele would do this. What good would it do her if she did this? Fismai's gaze slowly moved up, carrying a trace of anger and a trace of questioning. But from beginning to end, he did not ask. Adele did not disappoint him. She said indifferently, "From a moment you killed Sir Tito, I decided to avenge him. Your Majesty, do you have anything else to say today?" "So it was like this," Fismai murmured, a bitter smile appearing on his lips. As someone in power, he naturally would not give such a stupid order. All of this was Scarlet's own decision. But what was the use of saying this now? He was somewhat regretful. He regretted not keeping an eye on Scarlet and letting her do such a stupid thing. Adele suddenly pulled out the long sword in her hand, and Fismai's body fell powerlessly. Ding, ding, ding. The pure gold crown fell from Fismai's head and rolled far away, making a crisp sound. Everything happened too quickly. No one would have thought that Adele, the commander of the Scourge army, would actually plan such a perfect assassination. Many of the guards had yet to recover from their shock. When they came back to their senses, Fismai was already lying in a pool of blood. Protect the Divine King. Kill them. Only then did the guards come to their senses, roaring angrily as they rushed forward. Ron's eyes flashed with a bright light. Vast and powerful divine energy of death spread out and killed several of the guards, charging at the front like lightning, shocking everyone. "The Lich King is here. Who dares to move?" Shea shouted, blocking in front of Ron. Her snow-white, long legs trembled, and she kicked a headless corpse far away. The guards stopped in their tracks. They saw the Calamity God's scepter in Ron's hand. It was spinning like a ferocious beast that was about to devour its prey. The powerful divine power of death was so oppressive that it was hard for everyone to breathe. The guards were hesitant. Their eyes were filled with doubt and fear. At this time, there was a loud rumble. The ground outside the hall suddenly collapsed. In the smoke and dust that filled the sky, a huge monster-like figure was revealed. The monster waved its stingers, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. It let out a soul-stirring cry. It was in the direction of the dark altar. An endless stream of undead soldiers poured out from the collapsed hole. Under the leadership of the huge monster, they began to fight the guards of the dark altar. They were attacking the divine King Phizmai's dark altar. The faces of the guard in the hall were pale, and their legs trembled. They knew that once the dark altar was destroyed, the divine King Phizmai would never be revived. The dark altar was originally a heavily guarded place in the palace. But if the situation continued to develop like this, it was only a matter of time before it was breached. The guards looked at Ron, who was holding the scourge staff, and then looked at Phizmai, who was lying in a pool of blood. They couldn't make up their minds. It's all over. At this moment, Adele, who was holding a blood-stained longsword, stood up and slowly turned around. She coldly stared at the guards. As a commander of the Scourge Army, I order you to put down your weapons immediately. Clang, clang. Some of the guards heard this and immediately threw their weapons to the ground. Others hesitated, but after some internal struggle, they still chose to obey the order. At this moment, the battle at the Dark Altar was nearing its end. Under the crazy attacks of Spider Queen Lolth, Phizmai's Dark Altar was reduced to rubble when the blood-red skull flag once again floated above the ice-crowned castle. The castle had already changed owners. With Adele's cooperation, Ron quickly took control of the city. With the Scourge staff and the identity of the Lich King's successor, he effortlessly made these undead towns that were originally loyal to the divine King Phizmai surrender. Half a year later, the commander of the Plague Army, Serene, announced his loyalty to the new Lich King, Ron. The Plague Army returned to the Scourge Army. From this day onwards, the main plane of the undead was torn apart. The chaotic situation of endless war finally came to an end. The undead, who had been divided for 100,000 years, were once again united under the leadership of the Scourge Army. 100 years later, on the vast battlefield, groups of undead in black clothes and black armor silently advanced. They slowly walked into their battle formation according to the orders of their commander. Skeletons, zombies, black knights, meat grinders, bone dragons, frost dragons, and other undead creatures roared in low voices, silently waiting for orders to fight. From the sky, it looked like a black mass, like a surging river. There was no end to it, and it emitted a vast aura. This was an undead army of several hundred million, the main force of the Scourge Army. A blood-red skull flag fluttered in the wind. In the sky above the battlefield, countless undead souls danced in the air, letting out mournful cries. In front of this almost invincible undead army was the allied army of the Alliance of Justice. They had angels from the Legion of Holy Angels, elemental armies from Phoenix City, Moon Shadow Army from the High Elves, dwarven armies from the Ironforge Castle, and mechanical armies from the Goblins. All of them had solemn expressions, as if they were facing a great enemy. The Scourge Army was the most powerful existence in the main plane of the world. They had once been chaotic, fallen, divided, and at war with each other. However, a great leader had appeared among them. This leader took over the scepter of the previous king. With his powerful strength and wisdom, he quickly ended the chaotic situation and united the undead, becoming the most powerful existence in the main plane of the world. The one who created this miracle was a human necromancer. His name was Ron. As the Second War of the Main Plane slowly unfolded, everyone understood the strength and terror of the Scourge Army. The sea of skeleton warriors, the strange and terrifying necromancy magic, the indefensible crypt spiders, and the overlord of the sky, the frost wyrm. These powerful and terrifying undead creatures were like a surging tide. With their fearless fighting spirit, they continuously attacked the Alliance's defense line. The Scourge army flattened the grasslands, conquered the mountains, crossed the sea, defeated the Alliance's armies one after another, and conquered one city after another. And today, they finally stepped into the holy land of the main plane of order. It was known as one of the most incredible places in the main plane of the main plane, Cloud City. Cloud City was the main city of the Legion of Holy Angels. It was a floating piece of land that was built on 8 square kilometers of land. This piece of land was tens of kilometers above the ground. It was said that it could touch the clouds. This was also the origin of the name Cloud City. Even the people who lived here did not know how this piece of land floated in the air. They thought it was a miracle. In addition, this was the main city of the Alliance of Justice and Legion of Holy Angels. And today, the time for the final battle had finally arrived. The Scourge army once again stepped into Cloud City. Just like Hermes 100,000 years ago, it was the final battle with the Legion of Holy Angels. On the battlefield, it was solemn and solemn. Everyone held their breaths, waiting for the bugle call to attack. A Death Knight in heavy armor ran out from the undead army. She was riding an undead war horse. She wore a hideous skull mask that covered half of her face. The dark purple lips under the mask revealed a mocking smile. At this moment, she reined in her horse and stood still. She suddenly pulled out a long sword and pointed it forward. She let out a shrill cry. Kill! The Scourge army launched a charge. The undead surged forward like a surging tide, vowing to drown everything. On the ground, there was a mighty undead army. In the sky, there were endless gargoyles and frost wyrms. Get into formation and meet the enemy. The commander of the Alliance of Justice calmly gave the order. At this moment, his palms were full of sweat. Everyone knew that this was the final battle. If they lost, they would have nowhere to go. Behind them was Cloud City, the last fortress of the Alliance of Justice. Boom! The Alliance of Justice's army and the Scourge army of the undead collided fiercely. In an instant, people and horses were in a mess. Flowers of blood splattered everywhere. Corpses were strewn all over the place. Both sides had launched a soul-stirring battle. The Legion of Holy Angels stood up. Their paladins formed a square formation and continuously attacked the Scourge army. They were like a sharp knife, tearing apart the undead army's formation. The Elemental army stood up. Their magicians and magic paladins continuously released large-scale offensive spells. Destructive spells rained down from the sky, bombarding the undead army that was surging forward like a surging tide. The valiant dwarves wielded huge axes that were disproportionate to their bodies and chopped down the death paladins one by one. The elves used vines to form a long line of defense. When the Scourge army charged over, countless giant bears rushed out from the vines and attacked the undead army that was charging at the front. The battle in the sky was also very intense. The undead air force formed by the gargoyles, bone dragons, and frost dragons engaged in a decisive battle with the angels, griffin, phoenix, and giant dragons of the Alliance of Justice. Amidst the roars, creatures screamed and fell from the sky. However, the undead army was too big. They were densely packed, and there were at least a few 100 million of them. They advanced dauntlessly and fearlessly. Wave after wave of them surged towards the Alliance of Justice's formation. In the stalemate, the Alliance of Justice's formation was on the verge of collapse. The undead commander wearing a skull mask smiled. She could already foresee that the Scourge army would obtain the final victory in this battle. At this moment, there was a sudden change. A loud sound came from higher up in the sky, as if something had exploded. The airflow in the sky slowly condensed and turned into a huge vortex. Following that, traces of golden light appeared in the vortex. The light grew bigger and bigger until it fell to the ground like a meteor. Boom! There was an earth-shattering sound. The huge impact crushed the undead under it into meat paste. A tall and sturdy figure stood up from the golden light. He was wearing golden armor, and the muscles on his body bulged, emitting a biting cold and threatening aura. What? The undead commander was stunned. Her eyes under the skull mask were filled with shock. That is, at this moment, the golden-armored giant slowly raised his right hand. There was a faint flash of lightning in his right hand. Boom! Ah! Ron screamed and sat up abruptly. His eyes were wide open as he panted desperately. His face was pale. "Ron, you're having a nightmare again." A voice came from behind. Ron turned around and saw Kadena. She took a robe and gently draped it over Ron's body. "Thank you." Ron tightened his clothes and smiled bitterly. He had not recovered from the shock just now. Kadena hesitated. "Is it still the dream of the golden-armored giant?" "Yes." Ron nodded. "It's been more than a month. It's the same dream every time. When I fall asleep, it involuntarily appears in my mind. This is not a good omen." Kadena thought for a while and nudged Ron. "Maybe you should discuss it with Sister Shea and the others." The next day, in the Hall of the Dead in Iceground Castle, Ron, Adele, Shea, Serene, Rose, Nicole, Cronia, and the others had a meeting. He told everyone about the dream last night. "The nightmares of gods are not simple," Fear Demon King Saruman said with a serious expression. "Nightmares are often a subconscious reflection in the bottom of one's heart. Those golden-armored giants must be something that even gods are afraid of. In other words, Lord Lich King, there is a hidden fear in your heart." Saruman stared at Ron and said word by word, "Fear? I haven't found anything that can truly make me feel fear." Ron smiled and paused. "But what I want to know is, were those golden-armored giants?" Everyone was silent. No one could answer Ron's question. Golden-armored giants. Spider Queen Rose thought for a while. At this time, she suddenly raised her head and hesitated for a while before saying, "When I was following the previous Lich King, Hermes, I heard him mention a powerful race. This race was born as gods. Their bodies were huge and sturdy. They wore golden armor and held lightning in their hands. Perhaps these golden-armored giants were the race in your dream." Yes, that's right. Wearing golden armor and holding lightning in their hands, it was the race you were talking about." Ron's eyes lit up. "Then, did Lord Hermes mention the name of this powerful race?" Everyone looked at Rose at the same time. "He did. The name of this race is..." Rose hesitated and bit her lips. "Titans." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.